I had rented a small cabin deep in the northern woods for what I thought would be a quiet break from everything. It was at the edge of a state forest, miles from the nearest town, tucked away by a dirt road that curved through pine trees and thick brush. The listing described it as a hunting cabin, bare but functional, with a wood stove, an outhouse, and a small loft with a bed. I wanted the peace, the silence, and the sense of being away from people for a while. The cabin was about 2 hours from the nearest highway, and the final stretch of road was little more than a rutted trail. The tires of my car bounced in and out of deep mud grooves as I crept along, hoping I wouldn't bottom out or blow a tire before I even got there. My phone had lost service almost an hour earlier. That was expected, but the sudden realization of being cut off left a strange feeling in my stomach. When I finally saw the cabin, it looked smaller than in the pictures. The logs were weathered gray, the porch leaned slightly, and the chimney looked stained and crooked. It sat in a clearing, surrounded by tall trees, the forest pressing in from all sides. The ground around it was rough dirt and patches of moss. There wasn't another house, light, or road in sight. Inside, the cabin smelled like dust and old smoke. The furniture was rough wood, scratched and uneven. A single chair sat by the stove, a narrow counter stretched under a small window, and the loft above had a thin mattress. There was no running water, no electricity, only a few lanterns with cloudy glass. I set my gear down, unpacked some food, and tried to settle into the silence. At first, it was exactly what I wanted, just the sound of wind moving through trees and the occasional creak of the cabin. But that silence also began to press in on me. It made every little noise stand out, and I caught myself stopping to listen, convinced I had heard something outside. By late afternoon, I took a walk around the cabin. I didn't go far, just a loop through the trees to see what the area was like. The ground sloped slightly downward into thick brush and then deeper forest. There were game trails, broken branches, and soft dirt prints I couldn't quite identify. Probably deer. I told myself that anyway. As I circled back toward the clearing, I stopped short. There were boot tracks. Not mine. I had just come from the opposite direction. These were older, pressed deep into the dirt leading toward the cabin. The size was hard to judge, but they looked like heavy boots. Work boots, maybe. They were not fresh, but not old enough to be washed away by rain. They seemed to come from the trees and end at the edge of the clearing, like someone had walked toward the cabin and then stopped. I stared at them for a long time. Maybe they were from the owner, I thought. Maybe someone checking the place. But I didn't like how they ended, just there at the clearing, as if whoever made them had stood watching the cabin. That evening, I made a small fire in the stove, ate some food from a can, and tried to read by lantern light. But the shadows stretched strangely in the cabin, and I couldn't shake the thought of those tracks outside. Every time the wind rattled the walls or branches scraped the roof, I tensed. When I finally went to bed in the loft, I found myself listening for any noise outside. The woods were alive with small cracks and distant rustles, but one sound made me sit up in the dark. It was faint, but it wasn't the random scatter of an animal. It was steady, like footsteps in dirt. I held my breath. The sound stopped. I lay there, frozen, staring into the dark, my heart racing. Minutes passed with nothing more. Eventually, I told myself it was an animal. It had to be. The next morning, I went outside to check. The clearing looked the same, the trees still, the dirt road quiet. I walked around the cabin slowly. On the far side, near the edge of the brush, the dirt was scuffed. Not like paw prints, but like someone had stepped there recently, the soil pressed down with a shape too wide for an animal. My stomach tightened. I didn't want to think about it, but the feeling of being watched grew heavier. I told myself I was overthinking, that cabins like this always made people paranoid. Still, I couldn't shake the thought that someone else had been out there, moving around the trees when I couldn't see them. Later that day, I chopped some firewood with the old axe left at the cabin. The repetitive motion calmed me, but I kept glancing at the trees. The forest seemed endless, like anything could be standing just inside its shadow. I ate early and decided to secure the cabin before dark. I checked the windows, made sure the door latch was firm, and moved the chair against it. It felt childish, but it gave me some comfort. That night, the noises came back, more definite this time. Not just random snaps or rustles, but slow movement, circling. I lay in the loft, my chest tight, my ears straining. I could swear I heard breathing outside, faint but there, near the window. Then a scrape against the wall. I stayed frozen, clutching my flashlight, afraid to even shine it. Hours passed like that. Every time I thought it had stopped, another sound came. A crunch of dirt, a soft thud, like a footstep. At one point, I heard something brush against the porch. My pulse hammered in my ears. When dawn came, I was exhausted. I forced myself to go outside, half dreading what I might see. On the porch, in the thin layer of dirt and leaves, there were clear boot prints. They led up to the steps, stopped right by the door, and turned back toward the trees. My throat went dry. Someone had been right at the cabin, at the door, while I lay awake above them. I decided then that I couldn't stay much longer. But the problem was the road. My car was parked a good distance down the dirt track where the ground had been firmer. Walking to it meant going through the trees alone. I tried to convince myself it would be fine if I left during the day, but a deep unease gnawed at me. The rest of the day, I stayed close to the cabin, listening, watching. I thought I caught movement a few times, just quick shifts of shadow between trees, but I couldn't be sure. By evening, the silence felt heavier than ever. That night was worse, much worse. I hadn't even fallen asleep when I heard it. The soft creak of the porch boards under weight. Then a pause. Then another creak. My body went rigid. Whoever it was wasn't trying to be quiet now. They were right there, moving slowly across the porch. The door latch rattled. The sound was faint, but I heard it clearly. The wooden chair I had pushed against the door scraped slightly as pressure tested the frame. My skin went cold. I held my breath, every muscle locked, waiting. The rattling stopped. Silence. Then slow steps moved away, back across the porch, fading into the night. I didn't sleep at all. I sat upright, flashlight in hand, waiting for the first sign of daylight. When it came, I wasted no time. I grabbed my bag, shoved what I could inside, and decided I had to make it to the car. The forest felt different that morning. The air was heavy, the silence unnatural. As I walked quickly down the dirt road, I couldn't shake the sense of being followed. Every so often, I thought I heard soft steps behind me, but when I turned, there was nothing. The trees pressed close on either side, shadows deep between trunks. Finally, I saw my car ahead. Relief washed through me, but it was short-lived. On the driver's side window, smeared in the dust, was a handprint, large, clear, and recent. I froze, staring at it. My chest tightened, and a sick feeling spread through me. Whoever had been at the cabin had also been here, at my car, waiting, watching. I scrambled inside, locked the doors, and started the engine with shaking hands. The dirt road felt endless as I sped down it, the car bouncing and rattling over ruts. I kept glancing in the mirror, half expecting to see someone step out into the road behind me. When I finally reached pavement, I didn't stop driving for hours. Only when I hit the outskirts of a town did I pull over, my hands still trembling on the wheel. I never went back for the rest of my things at the cabin. I didn't contact the owner. I didn't want to explain. All I knew was that someone had been out there in those woods, circling the cabin at night, testing the door, leaving prints on my car. Someone who knew I was alone. And the worst part was knowing I would never know who they were or what they wanted, because I left before I found out. But I think that was the only reason I made it out. I had decided to spend a week alone in a cabin that I had rented deep in the woods, far away from the nearest town. It was something I had been thinking about for a while, mostly because I wanted to clear my head and escape from the noise of daily life. I found the cabin listing online. It was small, tucked at the edge of a forest that stretched for miles, and it was cheap compared to most places. The pictures showed a single-story wooden structure with a porch, a little chimney, and a gravel driveway that ended just a few feet from the door. It looked peaceful. The drive out to it was long. I had packed my car with food, water, and other supplies. I brought a cooler with ice, dry goods, a flashlight, a first aid kit, some knives, a small hatchet, and enough bottled water to last more than a week. I wanted to be sure I wouldn't have to leave for anything. I also carried a sleeping bag, even though the cabin had a bed, because I always felt more comfortable having my own bedding. The last 30 minutes of the drive were along a rough dirt road. The trees grew denser on both sides, and the farther I went, the narrower the road became. By the time I reached the cabin, I felt a strange sense of isolation. The cabin stood in a small clearing. The gravel drive was just wide enough for one car, and beyond that, there was nothing but thick woods. The air was cooler than in the town I had left. It smelled of pine and damp soil. I unlocked the cabin door and went inside. The first thing I noticed was the silence. It was heavy, almost pressing. The cabin was simple. One room served as the living space with a couch, a small table, and a kitchen area. To the side was a short hallway leading to a single bedroom and a bathroom. The wooden floor creaked under my weight. Everything looked old but sturdy. I spent the first day unpacking and getting comfortable. I set my cooler in the kitchen, stacked my water bottles in the corner, and checked all the windows and doors. They locked properly, although some of the latches felt loose. The cabin didn't have cell service, but I had known that before I came. I told myself it was part of the point, to be away from everything. Still, the idea that I couldn't call for help quickly if something went wrong bothered me more once I was actually there. The first night was calm. I built a small fire in the wood stove, made some food, and sat listening to the crackle of the wood. Outside, the wind moved through the trees, and sometimes I thought I heard other noises, like branches breaking or something moving through the undergrowth, but I reminded myself it was only animals. Deer, raccoons, maybe a bear. Nothing unusual for a forest this size. I went to bed late and had trouble sleeping at first. The cabin made sounds as it cooled, the wood popping, the roof settling. Each time I closed my eyes, I thought I heard faint steps outside, but when I held my breath and listened, the sounds would fade. I eventually fell asleep. The second day I spent exploring the area around the cabin. I followed a path that led into the woods behind the clearing. The trees grew tall and thick, blocking much of the sunlight. The ground was soft with fallen leaves and moss. After about an hour of walking, I came across an old, rusted fence half buried in the undergrowth. It stretched in both directions but was broken in places, as if no one had maintained it for decades. I didn't cross it. Instead, I walked along it for a while before turning back. That evening, when I returned to the cabin, I noticed something that made me pause. The gravel on the driveway looked disturbed, as if a vehicle had turned around there. I hadn't heard any engine during the day, and I was sure no one else was supposed to be here. The nearest house was several miles away. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it could have been my imagination or maybe an old mark I hadn't noticed before. Still, it unsettled me. I locked the cabin carefully that night. I made sure every window was latched, and I even wedged a chair under the door handle. As I lay in bed, I kept thinking about that disturbed gravel. It would have taken another car to make it, and the idea of someone else being up here without me knowing bothered me. The third day started normally. I made breakfast, read a book, and tried to relax. Around noon, I decided to cut some wood behind the cabin with the small hatchet I had brought. As I worked, I noticed something strange. On the far edge of the clearing, near the tree line, the grass looked pressed down in a way that reminded me of someone lying there. It was just a patch, but it stood out against the rest of the clearing. I walked over and examined it. The grass was bent and crushed, and in the dirt beneath it, I thought I saw a faint footprint. It was too large for an animal. I felt my chest tighten. Someone had been here. That night, I barely slept. Every creak of the cabin made me jump. Around midnight, I heard what I was sure were footsteps on the porch. Slow, deliberate steps. They stopped right outside the door. I lay frozen in bed, holding my breath, listening. The steps didn't continue. After what felt like hours, I heard them fade away into the woods. The next morning, I checked the porch. There were faint marks on the dusty wood. Not clear prints, but enough to show that someone had stood there. At that point, I thought seriously about leaving, but a part of me told myself I was overreacting. Maybe it was just my imagination. Maybe the marks were old. I tried to convince myself of that. I didn't want to feel like I had wasted the trip. But things got worse. On the fourth day, I woke to find one of the windows partly open. I was sure I had locked it the night before. The lock was still in place, but the window had been forced up just enough to create a gap. My heart pounded as I inspected it. Someone had tried to get inside. I spent the rest of the day on edge, checking the woods constantly. Every time the wind moved the branches, I thought I saw a figure. I carried the hatchet with me even inside the cabin. That night, I decided to stay awake. I turned off all the lights, sat in the dark living room, and waited. Around 2 in the morning, I heard movement outside. This time it was clear. Something or someone walked around the cabin slowly. Gravel crunched under their feet, then silence, then another crunch. I gripped the hatchet so tightly my hands hurt. The footsteps circled the cabin for what felt like an eternity. Sometimes they paused right outside the windows, as if whoever it was stood looking in. I sat in the darkness, not moving, barely breathing. Eventually, the sounds drifted away into the woods again. By morning, I was done pretending. Someone was stalking the cabin. I didn't know why, but it was happening. I decided I would leave. I packed quickly, stuffing everything into the car. But when I tried to start it, the engine wouldn't turn over. The battery was dead. I had checked it before leaving home, and it had been fine. Someone must have tampered with it while I slept. Panic set in. I was stuck. The nearest town was miles away, too far to walk safely without knowing if the person watching me was still around. I felt trapped inside the clearing, surrounded by thick woods and silence. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I pushed furniture against the doors and windows. I sat with the hatchet in one hand and the flashlight in the other, waiting for something to happen. Hours passed, and the silence pressed harder against me. Around 3 in the morning, I heard it again. Footsteps on the porch. This time, they didn't fade. They stopped right outside the door. The handle jiggled softly at first, then harder. Someone was testing it. I held my breath, my heart pounding so hard I thought it would give me away. After a long pause, the handle stopped moving. Then the sound of steps retreating. I stayed awake until dawn, every muscle in my body stiff with fear. When the sun finally rose, I made a decision. I couldn't stay another night. I packed a backpack with water, food, and a flashlight. I left the rest behind. I locked the cabin as best I could, even though I knew it didn't matter anymore. Then I started walking down the dirt road. The forest was silent as I walked. Every crack of a branch made me spin around, convinced I was being followed. I kept moving, forcing myself not to stop. After hours of walking, my legs felt heavy, but I didn't slow down. At one point, I looked back and saw movement far down the road, a figure just at the edge of sight. I couldn't make out details, but it was there. Someone was following me. I pushed myself harder, walking until my feet ached, until I felt lightheaded. The figure didn't get closer, but it didn't disappear either. It stayed at a distance, always just visible enough for me to know I wasn't imagining it. It wasn't until late afternoon that I finally reached the main road. Cars passed occasionally, and the sight of them felt unreal after so many days of isolation. I flagged one down. The driver looked concerned when he saw me, but I didn't stop to explain. I asked for a ride to the nearest town. When I finally got back to civilization, I felt a strange mix of relief and exhaustion. I checked into a small motel and locked the door. For hours, I just sat on the bed, listening to the distant hum of traffic, something I had once taken for granted, but now felt like the safest sound in the world. I went up to the cabin with the idea that a few days away from everything would clear my head. I had been running myself thin with work, staying too long at the office, and sitting in traffic for hours every day. I figured that being away from noise, screens, and the city might do me some good. The cabin I rented was not anything fancy. It sat by a quiet lake, tucked back in the woods where the nearest neighbor was more than a mile away. That was exactly what I wanted. Silence, distance, and space to breathe. The drive up there was long. The road narrowed the farther I went, turning from smooth highway to patched asphalt, then to dirt and gravel. The forest pressed in closer, blocking out most of the sky. When I finally saw the cabin, it felt more isolated than I expected. It was a small wooden place, weathered but sturdy, with a porch that looked out over the lake. The lake was still and dark, reflecting the line of pine trees along its shore. There was a small dock, half rotted, stretching out into the water. The quiet was heavy. I could hear my own footsteps crunching on the gravel when I got out of the car. Inside, the cabin smelled of old wood and dust. There was one main room with a bed pushed against the wall, a table, a couple of chairs, and a small stove. The windows were streaked but let in enough light. I unpacked the few things I had brought: a duffel bag with clothes, a small cooler, a flashlight, and a paperback book I doubted I would read. I locked the car, shut the cabin door, and for a while I just sat there listening to how quiet it was. No engines, no voices, no phones buzzing. Only the sound of the wind through the trees and the occasional creak of the cabin settling. The first day passed easily. I walked down to the dock, skipped stones across the lake, and sat in the sun until it started to drop behind the trees. When the evening came, the woods grew darker than I expected. There were no streetlights, no glow of distant towns, only blackness. I lit a lantern inside the cabin and made a simple meal. I tried reading but found myself more interested in just sitting and listening. Every crack outside seemed louder than it should. A branch snapping, something moving in the brush. I told myself it was normal. Animals were everywhere in these woods. Still, it made me keep checking the window more often than I wanted to admit. That night, I had trouble sleeping. The mattress was thin and the cabin walls groaned with the changing temperature. Around midnight, I thought I heard footsteps outside. They were slow, dragging across the porch. My chest tightened as I stared at the ceiling. I didn't move. I just listened. After a while, the sound stopped. I told myself it could have been an animal, maybe a raccoon or deer, but the porch had wooden steps and what I heard had weight. I stayed awake for hours, waiting for it to return, but it never did. The second day, I tried to shake off the nerves. I made breakfast and took a long walk through the woods. The trails were narrow and overgrown. At times, I lost sight of where I was going and had to backtrack. The forest was thick, and the air felt damp. I tried to enjoy the stillness, but I kept glancing over my shoulder. Once, I saw a tree with a strange mark carved into it. 2 lines crossing like an X, cut deep into the bark. It was old, weathered, not fresh, but it stood out. I convinced myself it was just some hiker's trail mark from years ago. Still, it stayed in my mind the whole walk back. That afternoon, I sat on the porch staring out at the lake. The water rippled lightly, though there was no wind. I thought I saw movement at the far shore, a figure near the tree-line, but when I blinked it was gone. My eyes could have played tricks on me with the way the light hit the water. I told myself that was it. I tried not to think more about it, but every time I looked at that stretch of trees, I felt unsettled. That night, I double-checked the locks on the cabin door. There was only one, a simple latch, not very strong. I pushed a chair up under the handle just in case. Sleep came harder than the night before. Around the same time, midnight again, I woke to the sound of something outside. This time it was not on the porch, but moving along the side of the cabin. I could hear the crunch of dirt, the slow drag of feet, the faint scrape against the wall. My mouth went dry. I didn't move from the bed. The steps circled, slow and deliberate, until they faded toward the back of the cabin. I held my breath, waiting for them to return, but they didn't. I lay awake until dawn. By the third day, I was jumpy at every sound. I thought about leaving, but the idea of packing up and driving back through the woods alone unsettled me almost as much as staying. I tried to keep myself busy. I went fishing at the dock, though I didn't catch anything. I sat in the sun trying to relax, but I kept looking at the tree-line across the water. At one point, I thought I saw movement again, a quick shift like someone stepping back into the shadows. It left me cold even though the air was warm. When night came, I was already tense. I sat with the lantern burning low and listened to every creak and groan of the cabin. Hours passed without anything unusual, but when I finally drifted off, I was woken by a sound that froze me. The door handle. It rattled softly as if someone was testing it. I stared at the door, unable to move, watching the handle twitch. The chair I had braced under it held firm, but the sound of someone quietly trying to get in was unmistakable. I stayed still, barely breathing. After what felt like forever, the handle stopped moving. Silence filled the cabin, but I could feel whoever it was still standing there. My skin crawled. Finally, after minutes that felt like hours, I heard slow footsteps moving off the porch into the dirt. I didn't sleep again that night. The next morning, I stepped outside for the first time with real fear in my chest. The ground around the porch was disturbed. There were prints in the dirt, human prints, bare feet. The sight made my stomach twist. Whoever had come in the night had not been wearing shoes. The tracks led off toward the trees and disappeared in the undergrowth. I stood there for a long time, staring, my hands shaking. I thought about leaving right then, but the thought of walking to the car and driving down those empty roads with the chance of someone waiting in the woods made me freeze. I told myself I would wait until daylight was stronger, until I could see more clearly. That was a mistake. That evening, the air felt heavier than before. I packed my bag and kept it near the door, ready to leave at first light. I sat in the dark with the lantern off, watching the window. The woods outside looked endless. When the night grew deeper, I heard it again. Slow steps, closer this time. The sound circled the cabin, scraping, dragging, pausing. My heart pounded. Then came a new sound, the window frame shifting. Someone was pressing against it, testing it. The glass creaked as if under strain. I held the flashlight in my hand, gripping it so tightly my knuckles hurt. The window didn't break, but the sound of that pressure went on for a long time. Then silence, then steps again. Hours of waiting, listening, every hair on my body standing on end. When dawn finally came, I made my decision. I couldn't stay another night. I grabbed my bag, unlocked the car, and threw everything inside. As I was about to start the engine, I noticed something that nearly made me sick. On the back window of the car, smeared in the dew, were the marks of a hand. A bare hand. The print was long, pressed flat as if someone had stood there watching in the night. I didn't look back at the cabin. I drove, tires slipping on the gravel, until I reached the main road. Even then, I didn't stop. I kept going until the forest thinned and houses appeared. Only then did I feel like I could breathe again. I never went back for the refund I was supposed to get for leaving early. I never told anyone the details of what happened. Not fully. What stayed with me most was not the footsteps, not the rattling door, not the handprint on the car, but the fact that whoever it was never tried to rush or force their way in. They just watched, waited, circled, and pressed against the edges of the cabin like they had all the time in the world. And that made me realize something worse than the thought of someone breaking in. They didn't want to break in. They wanted me to know they were there, and they wanted to see what I would do. That thought followed me back home, and I still think about it every night when I lock my door. I had been needing a break for a long time, and when I found the old cabin listing online, it seemed like the perfect way to get away from everything. It was small, deep in the woods, with no neighbors for miles. The photos showed a simple wooden cabin with a porch and a narrow dirt road leading up to it. There was no Wi-Fi, no phone service, and only a small generator for electricity. That was what I wanted: silence and distance from everything. The drive to the cabin was long. The paved road turned into a smaller gravel road, and then into a dirt path with ruts so deep that I thought my car might get stuck. Trees crowded the road on both sides. Their branches leaned over as if trying to block the way. When I finally reached the cabin, the sun was already beginning to sink low, throwing orange light through the woods. The cabin looked rougher in person than it had in the pictures. The wood was weathered, the roof sagged a little in the middle, and the porch had boards that creaked under my weight. But I told myself that was part of the charm. I unloaded my things: a cooler of food, a duffel bag with clothes, a sleeping bag, and a small box of supplies. Inside, The cabin was one big room with a stove in the corner, a small table, a couple of chairs, and a bed frame with an old mattress that looked thin and lumpy. The windows had no curtains, just empty glass panes. The silence hit me right away. I thought the forest would be full of sounds, but it wasn't. There was no traffic, no hum of distant houses, no voices, just the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze and the sound of my own steps on the wooden floor. That first night, I cooked a can of soup on the stove, ate quickly, and went outside. The woods stretched endlessly around the cabin. The dirt road disappeared into the trees, swallowed up after a short distance. I walked a little down it, but it was getting darker fast, and the thought of being far from the cabin after nightfall made my stomach tighten. I turned back. The air cooled quickly once the sun was gone. I could hear insects now, a faint buzzing around the trees. When I finally lay down on the mattress, I realized how thin the walls of the cabin were. Every sound outside carried through. The creak of branches, the scratching of something small in the dirt, the occasional snap of a twig. At some point in the night, I woke up. It was pitch black inside the cabin, the kind of darkness that feels solid. I wasn't sure what had woken me, but I sat there listening. There was a sound outside, faint but steady, like something moving slowly through the brush. Not a rabbit or a squirrel, it was heavier than that. I lay back down, pulling the sleeping bag over me, telling myself it was probably a deer. Still, my heart didn't slow down for a long time. The next morning, the unease had faded. Sunlight filtered through the trees, and everything looked different. I made coffee on the stove, ate a granola bar, and decided to walk farther down the road. I wanted to get a sense of the area around the cabin. The dirt road twisted and sloped downward for a while, then opened into a clearing where the grass was tall and wild. I saw an old rusted truck half buried in weeds, probably left there decades ago. Its windows were smashed out and the tires were gone. I walked around it, looked inside, then kept going. After another half mile, the road split into two paths. I stayed to the right, but after a while, I started worrying about getting turned around. I hadn't seen a single marker or sign. The forest was thick, and everything looked the same. I turned back, making sure to note the rusted truck so I'd know I was close to the cabin again. That night was colder. I kept the lantern on longer, not wanting to sit in the dark. When I finally switched it off, I lay there listening again. The forest seemed louder now. I heard an owl calling, then silence. A while later, I heard the same slow, deliberate movement outside the cabin. Not close this time, but not far either. I thought about looking out the window, but I couldn't make myself do it. I stayed still, listening until I drifted into a restless sleep. On the third day, I tried to settle in more. I chopped some fallen branches for firewood, boiled water, and sat on the porch reading. The quiet was still strange. It felt like the forest was holding its breath sometimes. Every now and then, I would feel like I was being watched, even though I saw nothing but trees. Late in the afternoon, I heard something from deeper in the woods, a sharp crack, like a branch breaking under weight. I froze, straining to hear. Another sound followed, softer but steady. Footsteps, slow and spaced apart as if someone was walking. I scanned the trees but saw nothing. The sound stopped, and after a while I convinced myself it was an animal. That night I barely slept. I kept waking up to noises. Brush moving, sticks snapping, something heavy shifting its weight outside. Around midnight, I was sure I heard something scrape against the side of the cabin. Just once, faintly, but enough to send a shock through me. I held my breath, waiting. Nothing followed, but I stayed wide awake until dawn crept through the trees. By the fourth day, I couldn't shake the feeling anymore. I went back to the rusted truck and then farther down the road, trying to see if there were any signs of hunters or campers, but I found nothing. No tire tracks, no footprints, just the endless dirt road. Back at the cabin, I checked around the perimeter. I didn't see anything at first, but near the back corner, where the grass was high, I noticed the earth was disturbed. Flattened grass, a faint depression in the dirt, like someone had stepped there recently. It wasn't an animal track. It was too broad, too shaped. It looked like part of a boot print, I stared at it for a long time, telling myself it might just be mine from walking around earlier, but the tread looked sharper, fresher. That evening, I stacked a few heavy pieces of wood against the inside of the door before lying down. I didn't think they'd stop someone determined to come in, but it made me feel a little better. Sometime in the night, I woke again. The sound came first, soft, slow steps on the porch outside. My chest tightened so hard it hurt. The boards creaked, one at a time, as if someone was carefully testing their weight. I stayed completely still, breathing shallowly, staring into the darkness. The steps reached the door, then silence. I imagined someone standing just on the other side, listening. My heart hammered so hard I was sure it could be heard. I don't know how long I lay there like that. Minutes, maybe an hour. Eventually, I must have drifted into a half sleep, because the next thing I knew, the cabin was filled with thin gray morning light. By then, I was done pretending this was in my head. I packed some of my food and stuffed it into my backpack. I thought about leaving right then, but I told myself I'd last until morning when there was more daylight to travel. That day, I didn't relax at all. Every sound in the woods put me on edge. I thought I saw movement once, a shape slipping behind the trees, but when I looked harder, it was gone. That night, I didn't even try to sleep. I sat up in the chair by the table, the lantern burning low, the heavy wood still stacked against the door. The forest outside was alive with small noises, but then, closer to midnight, it happened again. Steps on the porch. Slow, careful, measured. The lantern flickered. My mouth went dry. The steps paused by the window. I couldn't see anything through the dark glass, but I felt it, that someone was standing there only a few feet away, watching. I didn't move until dawn. My legs ached from sitting so rigid, but I didn't dare shift. When the sun came up, I made my decision. I wasn't staying another night. I packed everything into my bag, filled my water bottle, and locked the cabin door behind me even though it was pointless. The walk down the road felt different now. The forest wasn't peaceful. It was heavy, pressing in on all sides. I kept glancing back, certain I would see someone following, but the road stayed empty. When I passed the rusted truck, I noticed something I hadn't before. The weeds around it were crushed, bent down, as if someone had stood there recently. I didn't stop. I kept walking. The miles dragged. My pack grew heavier. The road stretched longer, but I forced myself on. Every crack of a branch behind me made my heart jump. I didn't stop moving until I finally saw the first sign of pavement far ahead. When I reached my car, parked where the dirt road met the gravel, I tossed the pack in and started the engine immediately. My hands shook so badly I could barely turn the key. I didn't look back as I drove. The trees thinned, the road widened, and soon I was on the highway. Only then did I let myself breathe. I never went back to that cabin. I never even tried to find out who owned the land or if anyone else had stayed there. I just left it behind. But sometimes, late at night, I still think about those footsteps on the porch, slow and patient, as if whoever it was knew I was inside, waiting, too afraid to move. That's what scares me the most. Not that someone was out there, but that they never tried to come in. They just watched, and maybe they were waiting for me to open the door first. I had been planning the trip for weeks, maybe months if I counted all the hours I spent daydreaming about it at work. My job had drained me so badly that even simple things like reading a book or sitting on the porch at home felt impossible. My mind always ran back to deadlines, to emails, to the noise of people always needing something. What I wanted was quiet, just pure silence away from everything. I wanted a place where I would not hear phones or see traffic lights or bump into people I knew. That was when I decided I would rent a cabin far off in the woods, something out of the way, something no one could bother me at. When I found the place online, the pictures showed a simple one-bedroom log cabin, sitting on a patch of land with trees pressing close on three sides and a narrow dirt road winding up to it. The listing mentioned no neighbors within miles, no cell service, no internet, and a small creek behind the cabin. It sounded perfect to me. The idea of being unreachable, even just for a few days, made my chest feel lighter. I booked it for 5 nights, The drive up took longer than I thought. The paved road gave way to gravel, then narrowed to a dirt track that climbed through endless rows of pines. My small car shook and bounced, and at times I wondered if it would even make it to the end. When I finally saw the cabin through the trees, I felt relieved. It looked exactly like the pictures, maybe even better. It sat with its back to the woods and its front facing the road and a small open clearing. The roof was dark green metal, and the walls were heavy logs, stained almost black with age. A single porch stretched across the front, and there was one rocking chair on it. I parked near the steps, turned off the engine, and just sat there for a moment with the windows down. The air smelled sharp and cold, even though it was late summer. The forest around me was so quiet that it almost rang in my ears. I didn't hear cars or people, only the faint sound of leaves shifting with the breeze and the distant rush of water from the creek. The key had been left under a rock by the door, just like the owner said. I let myself in. Inside, the cabin was small but comfortable. The main room was open with a little kitchen on one side and a living space on the other, with a wood stove in the corner and stacks of logs beside it. A narrow hall led to the bedroom and a bathroom. There was electricity, though it felt odd turning on a light in such a secluded place. The fridge was empty except for a couple of bottles of water left by the owner. I set my cooler and bags on the counter and looked around slowly, taking it all in. The first day passed quietly. I unpacked food and clothes, walked around the clearing to get a sense of the land, and followed the sound of the creek. It was only about 200 feet behind the cabin, hidden under trees, running fast over smooth stones. The water was clear, so clear I could see little fish darting in the shadows. I crouched there for a long time just listening, the way the water drowned out everything else. For the first time in months, I felt my shoulders drop, the constant pressure in my chest easing. That night, I cooked a small meal on the stove and sat at the table eating in the quiet. I had brought a book, but I found myself staring out the window more than reading. The woods seemed darker than anywhere I had ever been, the kind of darkness that didn't just fall but pressed in. By 9 o'clock, the quiet had grown so heavy that I went to bed early, pulling the blanket tight around me. Sometime deep in the night, I woke suddenly. I didn't know why. My eyes opened, and I just lay there in the dark staring at the ceiling. The cabin creaked, the kind of settling noise old wood makes, but then I thought I heard something else, something faint. It was like a crunch on gravel or leaves, slow and deliberate, outside near the porch. I held my breath and listened hard. The sound didn't come again. After a long while, I convinced myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer moving around. Eventually, I fell back asleep, though it took a while. The next morning, I stepped outside early with a cup of coffee in my hand. The clearing looked normal, untouched. The dirt road stretched away, lined by trees. But as I walked down the steps, I noticed something odd in the dirt at the edge of the clearing. There were marks, shallow impressions like footprints, though faint. I crouched down and looked closer. They weren't clear enough to tell what they were, but they didn't look like animal tracks. The ground was too dry to capture detail, but the spacing looked like steps. I stood there for a while, staring down the road, then told myself it was probably my own tracks from when I drove up and walked around yesterday. Even though I couldn't remember stepping exactly there, I let the thought settle in because it was easier than thinking otherwise. The second day was calm again. I hiked a bit farther, following a faint trail behind the cabin that led deeper into the trees. The woods felt endless, the kind that swallows sound. At one point, I stopped and realized how far I had gone. The cabin was out of sight, and the air was so still it was almost suffocating. That was when I heard a sharp crack of a branch somewhere off the trail. I froze, listening, scanning the trees. My mind told me it was just a deer or maybe a squirrel, but my body reacted differently. My skin prickled, and I turned back the way I had come, walking faster until I saw the cabin through the branches again. That night, I couldn't shake the unease. I checked the locks twice, pulled the curtains closed tight, and left one light on in the main room. Lying in bed, I tried to slow my breathing, but every time the cabin popped or shifted, I felt my chest tighten. I must have dozed off eventually because I woke again to silence so heavy it was almost painful. Then came the sound. This time it was clearer, more deliberate footsteps on the porch. The boards creaked softly once, then again. My throat closed up, and I lay frozen in the bed, listening with every muscle in my body tensed. The steps stopped. I waited for a knock, for the door handle to rattle, for something. But there was nothing, just silence. After what felt like an hour but was probably only minutes, I forced myself to move. I crept to the bedroom door, opened it slowly, and peered down the hall. The faint glow from the light in the living room stretched across the floor. I couldn't see the door from where I stood, but everything seemed still. I stood there a long time, not daring to breathe. When nothing happened, I backed into the bedroom, shut the door, and sat in the chair by the window, watching the tree line until dawn. In the morning, I finally walked out onto the porch. The boards creaked under my weight, the same sound I had heard in the night. I scanned the clearing, the trees, the dirt road. There, in the dust near the steps, were clearer footprints. They were human, not boots or heavy shoes, but bare feet. The prints showed toes, heels, and the distinct arch of a foot. They led up to the porch, right to the steps, and then turned back into the clearing. I stood there a long time, staring at them. My stomach turned cold. Someone had been here in the night, walking barefoot through the woods, right up to my cabin. My first thought was to leave, to throw everything in the car and drive back down that winding dirt road until I found pavement again. But then I thought of how far it was, how much gas it would take, and how I had paid for 5 nights. Maybe it was just someone passing through, maybe a local who knew the woods well and wandered near out of curiosity. I tried to convince myself it wasn't a threat. Still, the thought gnawed at me all day. That night, I couldn't sleep at all. I kept the light on, sat in the chair, and listened. Hours passed. Around 3 in the morning, I heard it again. The crunch of leaves outside, slow, measured, circling the cabin this time. I gripped the arms of the chair, staring at the door. The sound moved from one side of the cabin to the other, then up the porch steps. The boards groaned. Whoever it was didn't knock, didn't try the handle, just stood there. I could feel it, the presence of someone just on the other side of the door, waiting. I didn't move until the sound finally faded, the steps trailing off into the woods. When daylight came, I opened the door and saw the tracks again, circling the cabin, stopping at the door. By the 4th day, I was done. I packed my bags fast, shoved everything into the car, and started down the dirt road. But the road felt different now, narrower, longer. I drove slow, checking the mirrors every few seconds. At one point, I thought I saw movement in the trees, someone darting between them, keeping pace with my car. My hands shook on the wheel, and I pressed the gas harder, bouncing over rocks and ruts until the road finally opened up to gravel and then pavement. Only then did I stop, pulling over on the side of the road. My chest heaved as I tried to calm myself. I looked back once, down the dirt track, and the trees stood there, quiet and still, hiding whatever had been watching me. I didn't go back. I never told anyone about it, not really. I said the cabin was fine, that it was peaceful, that I just left early because I was tired of being alone. But the truth stayed with me. That in the middle of that forest, miles from anyone else, someone had been walking barefoot around my cabin at night, watching, waiting, never saying a word, never showing themselves. And the worst part was knowing I would never know why. I drove up to the cabin late in the afternoon, the road narrowing the deeper I got into the woods. The gravel crunched under my tires and the trees leaned over the road, cutting out most of the daylight. It had been a long week and I thought getting away from everything would be good for me. The cabin wasn't mine, but it belonged to a friend of a friend who let people use it when it wasn't occupied. It was supposed to be quiet, simple, and cut off from the noise of daily life. That was what I thought I wanted. The air grew colder the higher I climbed, and the road twisted more sharply until I could barely see ahead. I felt a little uneasy already, only because the road was so deserted. I hadn't seen another car in over an hour, not even someone coming down the mountain. The forest pressed in thick on both sides. The tall pines were dark and heavy, and the undergrowth so tangled that I knew if I wandered off the road, I'd get lost quickly. When I finally saw the cabin, I felt some relief. It sat back from the road on a small rise, surrounded by trees, but with just enough space cleared out to give it some breathing room. It was simple, made of weathered wood, 1 story high, with a porch that sagged slightly. There was no fence, no neighbors, and no sound except the faint rustling of leaves in the wind. I parked beside it and cut the engine. The silence that followed was thick. No birdsong, no running water, just the wind pressing through the trees. I grabbed my bag and carried it up to the porch. The wood creaked under my weight and the door stuck before it opened, but eventually I got inside. The inside smelled like old pine and dust. There was one main room with a couch, a small table, and a wood stove. A door on the far wall led to a bedroom with a narrow bed, and another door led to a bathroom. It was as simple as it could get, but it was clean enough. I set my bag down and walked around, checking the windows, testing the light switches, and making sure the place felt secure. The electricity worked, though it flickered weakly, and the water came from a pump that groaned when I tested the sink. It wasn't modern comfort, but it would do. I thought I would settle in, cook something simple, maybe read, and then get a good night's sleep. That was the plan. It wasn't until night started to fall that I noticed how quickly the forest seemed to close in. The trees turned into dark shapes pressed against the windows. The last bit of daylight disappeared faster than I expected, and soon the cabin was just a small box of light in a sea of black. I turned on a single lamp and tried to keep myself occupied, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was more cut off than I had thought. The first sound came not long after. It was faint, almost like a branch snapping somewhere outside. I froze and listened. Nothing followed it. I told myself it was just the wind, maybe a small animal. The woods were full of life after all. I tried to ignore it, but then another sound came, a slow crunch, like footsteps on dry leaves. I stood up, heart beating hard, and walked to the window. I couldn't see anything. The lamp inside cast too much reflection on the glass. All I saw was myself looking back. I turned the light off and pressed closer, trying to peer out into the dark. Still nothing, just trees swaying in the faint wind. I stayed there a while, listening, but the sound didn't repeat. Eventually I sat back down, though I couldn't focus on what I was reading anymore. Later that night, after I had climbed into bed, I heard it again. This time it was louder, definite movement outside, slow and deliberate, circling the cabin. My mouth went dry and I held my breath, straining to hear. The footsteps paused, then shifted again, moving closer to the porch. I sat up and reached for the flashlight I had set on the floor beside me. I didn't want to open the door, not with the sound so close, but I had to know what was out there. I crept into the main room and stood by the window again. Nothing but darkness. I considered turning on the porch light, but that would only blind me more from the inside. Instead, I stood perfectly still, listening. The footsteps stopped completely, as if whoever or whatever it was knew I was paying attention. The silence was heavier than before, thick enough that every creak of the cabin felt louder. I stayed there a long time, gripping the flashlight, waiting for something to happen. Eventually, after what felt like forever, I convinced myself it had just been an animal. Maybe a deer moving through the brush, maybe even a bear. Something ordinary. I forced myself back to bed, though I hardly slept at all. The morning light made everything seem less threatening. The forest looked normal again, the sky clear and bright. I stepped outside and walked around the cabin, searching for any sign of what I had heard. The ground was thick with pine needles and leaves, making it hard to see tracks. But in one patch of dirt near the porch, I thought I saw a footprint. It was faint, but it looked human, larger than mine, pressed down deep as though someone had stood there a long time. I felt a chill run through me. I kept telling myself it could have been old, maybe from someone who stayed here before me. Still, the thought of someone being that close during the night made me uneasy. The day passed slowly. I tried to distract myself with chores, chopping some wood for the stove, cleaning up inside, and walking a little way down the road. But the forest felt heavier than it had before, the silence broken only by the occasional crow. I kept glancing back at the cabin, afraid of losing sight of it. By late afternoon, I was already dreading the night. I made a fire in the stove and cooked a simple meal, but I had no appetite. I kept checking the windows, listening for the slightest sound. As the light faded again, my nerves grew worse. That night, the sounds came earlier. This time, there was no mistaking them. Definite footsteps, slow and steady, moving just beyond the edge of the porch. I killed the lamp and crouched low, watching the window. The steps circled, pausing here and there, and then I heard the creak of the porch boards. My stomach twisted as I realized someone was standing right outside the door. I held my breath so long my chest ached. The sound of weight shifting on the boards was unmistakable. Whoever it was stood there for what felt like minutes, not moving, not knocking, just standing. I imagined a face pressed close to the wood, listening for me. Then, just as quietly, the footsteps moved away again. Back down the steps, back into the leaves. I stayed frozen, waiting for them to return, but the night grew quiet again. I didn't sleep at all after that. I sat in the main room with the flashlight and a heavy piece of wood from the fire pile, gripping it like a weapon. Every sound outside made me tense, but nothing else came close. When morning finally came, I felt drained and shaky. I went outside again and checked the porch. This time, there was no mistaking it. Fresh prints on the boards, clear from the damp of the night air. They were big, larger than my own, and they faced the door directly. Someone had been standing there. I thought about leaving right then, but the cabin was remote, and the nearest town was hours away. I convinced myself it was just some drifter passing through. Maybe they were curious, maybe they thought the cabin was empty. I tried to believe they had moved on, but the third night proved me wrong. It started the same, footsteps circling, the weight on the porch, the waiting silence. But this time, the doorknob rattled. Just a faint shake at first, then harder, as if testing the lock. My whole body went cold. I gripped the wood in my hands, ready for the door to burst open, but it didn't. After a few tries, the sound stopped. Whoever it was stepped off the porch again and disappeared into the trees. I didn't sleep again, not a single second. At first light, I packed my things, threw them into the car, and started down the road. The cabin was supposed to be a place to relax, but I couldn't stand one more night there. As I drove, I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone following. When I finally reached town, I stopped at a gas station. As I filled the tank, I noticed dried mud on the side of my car door, near the handle. Smears as though someone with dirty hands had tried to open it during the night. That was when I knew I hadn't imagined anything. Someone had been out there watching me, circling the cabin, testing the door, and even trying the car. Whoever it was hadn't left, and I didn't want to think about what would have happened if the lock had failed. I never went back to that cabin again. I remember the exact feeling I had when I turned off the last stretch of paved road and the gravel crunched under my tires. It was late in the afternoon, a dull gray sky stretching above the pines, the kind of sky that made it feel like the sun was setting even though it still had an hour or two left before it dropped behind the hills. The cabin I was driving to sat at the far end of a narrow, uneven road that seemed less like something built for cars and more like an overgrown trail that simply tolerated them. Every few minutes, I would slow almost to a crawl to avoid hitting a rock or sliding into the shallow ditches carved by years of rainwater. The trees on both sides stood tight and dark, forming a wall that made the world feel closed in. The air through the open window smelled damp, like wet dirt and pine needles, and I noticed how quiet it was compared to the hum of the highway I had left behind. It was the kind of silence that seemed heavy, like it pressed in on you, the kind that made your own movements sound louder than they should. I had rented the cabin for a week, hoping to get away from the noise of the city and the constant rush of work. I had been feeling worn down for months, waking up tired no matter how long I slept, and I thought the solitude might help. The cabin had been advertised as isolated, sitting on private land deep in the forest. The listing had shown a small wooden structure with a tin roof, a porch, and a lake not far away. It had looked simple, even plain, but that was what I wanted. When I finally reached the clearing where the cabin stood, I pulled my car up near the side and turned off the engine. The sudden silence was sharper than before, as though the trees swallowed the sound completely. I stepped out and stretched, listening to the crunch of gravel under my boots. The cabin looked just like the pictures. Weathered wood, a porch with 2 steps, a single window facing the clearing, and a door that looked newer than the rest of the building, maybe replaced a few years ago. Behind it, the trees continued unbroken, thick and dark. I carried my bags inside, setting them down just inside the door. The interior smelled faintly of old wood and dust, but it was dry and well kept. There was one main room with a small table, a few chairs, a bed pushed up against the far wall, and a cast iron stove in the corner. A second door led to a tiny bathroom with a pump sink and a compost toilet. The windows were small, letting in only thin light, and when I shut the door behind me, the inside felt dim and close. I unpacked slowly, putting food in the small pantry, clothes in a wooden chest, and books on the table. The quiet seemed louder in here, broken only by the occasional groan of the wood settling. I checked my phone and saw no signal at all, not even a single bar. That hadn't surprised me, but it drove home how far away I was from anything. I turned it off to save battery and set it aside. By the time I finished unpacking, the light outside was dimmer, the gray sky sinking into the first hints of dusk. I stepped outside to take in the air and looked around the clearing. The trees ringed the cabin closely, except to one side where a faint trail wound toward the lake. I could see a patch of water through the trunks, reflecting the dull light. I thought about walking down there, but decided to wait until morning. That first night was uneventful, but it set the tone for the rest of my stay. I lit a lantern, cooked a simple meal on the stove, and sat at the table listening to the silence outside. Every now and then I thought I heard faint cracks or rustles from the forest, but I told myself it was just branches shifting or small animals moving through the undergrowth. When I finally climbed into bed, the mattress felt firm and unfamiliar, and I lay awake for a long time staring at the dark ceiling, listening. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke suddenly, unsure why. The cabin was completely dark except for the faint line of gray moonlight around the edges of the window. My ears strained, and I realized I had heard something outside. A faint crunch, like a footstep on gravel or dry leaves. I held still, barely breathing, waiting for another sound. After a long minute, there was nothing, and I told myself it was probably an animal wandering near the clearing. Deer, maybe. I turned over and forced myself back to sleep. The next morning I woke early, the air cool and damp. I boiled water for coffee and then walked down the trail to the lake. The trail was narrow, lined with ferns and thick underbrush, and the air smelled of wet soil. When I reached the water, it stretched out quiet and flat, reflecting the pale sky. The surface was broken only by the occasional ripple of fish near the edges. I stood there for a long time, breathing in the damp, listening to the faint lap of water on the shore. Back at the cabin, I spent most of the day reading, writing in a notebook, and sitting on the porch. The isolation felt good, but there was always a faint edge of unease I couldn't explain. The silence was so complete that any noise stood out sharply. A branch falling in the woods sounded close even when it wasn't. The creak of the cabin's boards made me pause and glance around. I kept telling myself it was just because I wasn't used to being so far from people. That night, I woke again. This time, the sound was clearer. A deliberate crunch of footsteps moving through the clearing. My chest tightened as I lay frozen, listening. The steps were slow, uneven, as though someone or something was moving carefully. They passed close to the side of the cabin, then stopped. I waited, my heart beat loud in my ears. After what felt like minutes, the sound started again, moving away toward the trees. Eventually, silence returned. In the morning, I walked the perimeter of the clearing, looking for tracks. The ground was soft in places, damp with last week's rain, but I didn't see anything clear. I told myself again that it could have been a deer, maybe even a bear, though the sound had felt different, heavier, steadier. I pushed the thought aside and tried to focus on enjoying the day. The third night was worse. I had just drifted into sleep when I heard it again, the crunch of footsteps. This time, they stopped right outside the window near the bed. I froze, staring at the faint outline of the glass, and thought I saw a shadow move past. My throat was dry, my whole body rigid with fear. I waited, but no knock came, No voice, no movement inside. After a long time, the steps moved away into the forest. The next morning, I checked again for signs in the clearing. Near the edge by the trees, I finally saw something. A faint impression in the dirt, almost like the heel of a boot. It wasn't clear enough to be certain, but once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. My stomach twisted as I stood there, staring at the ground. If someone had been out here, that meant they had walked through the clearing in the middle of the night, watching, listening. I thought about leaving, but the nearest town was hours away, and part of me didn't want to believe it. I told myself again it might have been an animal, that the print was just a trick of light and soil. I spent the rest of the day inside, my nerves stretched thin, every sound making me tense. That night, I didn't sleep much. I lay in bed with my heart pounding, waiting. Around midnight, it came again. The steps were slower this time, circling the cabin. I heard the crunch of gravel on one side, then the faint crack of twigs on the other. It went on for what felt like an hour, circling, pausing, moving again. I gripped the flashlight beside my bed but didn't move, too afraid to draw attention. Eventually, the sounds faded into the woods, and I lay awake until dawn. By the 5th day, I was exhausted. My hands trembled when I tried to cook breakfast, and my eyes felt gritty from lack of sleep. I thought seriously about packing up and leaving, but part of me still clung to the idea that I was imagining it, that I was working myself up over nothing. That night, the sound came earlier. As I sat at the table reading, I heard it, the crunch of footsteps outside. This time, they didn't just pass by. They stopped at the porch. I heard the faint creak of the wooden step as weight pressed down on it. My stomach turned cold. Slowly, the sound moved across the boards, stopping right outside the door. I sat frozen, every muscle locked, staring at the wood as though I could see through it. After a long, silent moment, the steps moved back off the porch and into the clearing. The next morning, I made my decision. I packed quickly, stuffing clothes into my bag and food back into boxes. I carried everything to the car, loading it with shaking hands. I took one last look at the cabin, its dark windows staring back at me, then climbed into the driver's seat. As I started the engine, I glanced toward the trees at the edge of the clearing. For a split second, I thought I saw movement, a figure slipping between the trunks, too far to see clearly, but shaped like a person. My chest tightened, and I pressed the accelerator, the gravel spitting under the tires as I turned onto the narrow road. The drive out felt longer than the way in. Every twist of the road, every shadow between the trees, made me tense. I kept glancing in the mirrors, half expecting to see someone behind me. Only when I reached the paved road again did I let out a long, shaking breath. I didn't stop until I was back in town. I had rented the cabin for a week because I wanted to get away from everything. Life back in town had been noisy and messy, and I felt like my head had been stuffed with static for months. When I saw the listing online, the photos of the wooden place surrounded by tall pine trees made me think it would be the perfect escape. It wasn't fancy. It wasn't meant for luxury. It was a simple wooden box with a tin roof and a small porch, miles away from anyone else. The ad had said it was quiet, private, and isolated. At that time, that sounded like heaven to me. I packed light, just some clothes, food, water, and a few tools like a flashlight, a camping knife, and my old lantern. The drive there had taken longer than expected. The paved road had ended, and a gravel track had gone on, winding through trees, climbing hills, and dipping into valleys. The farther I went, the more I realized how alone I was going to be. My cell phone had lost signal after about half an hour on that track. By the time I pulled up to the cabin, I knew I had crossed some invisible line where normal life couldn't reach me anymore. The cabin stood in a small clearing, surrounded by thick forest. It looked old but sturdy. The logs were dark from age, the windows were small, and the roof had patches of rust. There was a stone chimney on one side and a small pile of chopped wood stacked neatly near the porch. A path led down toward what looked like a narrow creek behind the trees. The place smelled of pine needles, damp soil, and with smoke that must have lingered from the last person who stayed there. I unlocked the front door with the key the owner had mailed me. The inside was simple. A single room made up most of it, with a wood stove, a small table, a bed, and shelves stocked with some basics. There was no electricity, no running water. Just a few jugs of fresh water the owner had said would last a while, plus a well outside if I needed more. There was a small outhouse about 20 yards from the cabin, tucked back among the trees. That first evening, I felt good. The quiet was heavy but comforting. The only sounds were wind moving through the pines and the occasional snap of a branch somewhere in the woods. I unpacked, lit a lantern, cooked a simple meal, and sat by the stove listening to the crackle of the fire. I thought to myself that this was exactly what I had needed. But isolation has a way of changing shape when the sun goes down. The first night, I woke to a sound outside. At first, I thought it was wind, but then I heard it again. A heavy crunch of leaves. Slow, deliberate, not constant, not like an animal scurrying, but spaced out, like footsteps. I held my breath and lay completely still. My lantern had gone out, and the cabin was dark except for faint light leaking through the window from the moon. My heart started thumping, and my ears strained. Again, the sound came. Leaves, wait, pause. Closer this time. I told myself it was probably a deer, maybe even a bear. The owner had mentioned wildlife. I stayed frozen for what felt like forever until the sound faded away into the forest. Eventually, exhaustion won, and I drifted back to sleep. The next morning, I walked around the cabin to see if anything was disturbed. The ground was soft with pine needles, so it was hard to see clear tracks, but I thought I saw impressions near the edge of the clearing. Not paw prints, not hooves, but shapes that looked too flat and long, almost like shoes, but smudged. I tried to brush it off. I told myself it could be my own tracks from when I arrived, but I knew I hadn't walked over there. I spent the day exploring the area, walking along the creek, and gathering some wood. The place was beautiful in the daylight. Sunlight streamed through the branches, insects buzzed, and the water moved slow and clear. I tried not to think about the noises from the night before. That night, though, the sounds came back. This time, I was sure they were footsteps. Slow, careful, circling. I sat up in bed, straining to hear, holding my breath. Every creak in the wood of the cabin felt deafening. My eyes kept darting to the window, expecting to see a face pressed against the glass, but all I could see was blackness outside. At some point, there was a knock. Not loud, just a single, soft knock against the wall near the window. I felt my stomach turn cold. I stayed perfectly still, clutching the knife I had kept by the bed. There was no reason for anyone to be here. Nobody even knew me here. The knock never came again, but the footsteps stayed for what felt like hours, fading and returning like whoever or whatever was out there didn't want to leave. By morning, I hadn't slept much. My body felt heavy, my head foggy. I stepped outside slowly, scanning the trees. The forest was still. No movement, no sound except birds. But near the edge of the clearing, I saw something new. A stick had been placed upright in the dirt, balanced carefully like it was meant to stand. Nothing else, just a single stick planted in the ground. It wasn't there yesterday. I stared at it for a long time. The longer I looked, the more certain I was that it had been done on purpose. Maybe some hunter passing through? But why? The thought that someone had come close enough to do that while I slept made my chest tighten. I kicked it over and tried to move on with my day, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The third night was worse. I had barricaded the door with a chair and some firewood. I left no lantern lit, hoping darkness would make me less noticeable. I lay awake, straining to hear. Sure enough, not long after midnight, the sounds began again. Slow steps through the leaves, sometimes close, sometimes farther, circling, always moving. My skin crawled with every shift of weight outside. At one point, I heard the door handle move, slowly, gently, testing it. The wood creaked under the faint pressure. My body went rigid. I gripped the knife tighter, sweat dripping down my forehead. The handle stopped after a few moments, but I didn't move. I barely breathed. The steps shifted around again, toward the back of the cabin this time. Then a scrape like something dragging across the wall. Not fast, not rough, just a slow, deliberate scrape. I stayed frozen until the first hint of dawn light crept through the window. Only then did the sounds finally fade away. When I went outside that morning, my stomach turned. Behind the cabin, carved into the wood of the wall, were long, thin scratches. Not deep, but deliberate, for lines side by side, about the height of a man's hand. I knew then this wasn't an animal. Someone was out there. Someone who wanted me to know they were out there. The days started to blur. I barely ate. I barely slept. Every little noise in the forest made me jump. I thought about leaving, but the idea of walking that long gravel road alone, through miles of forest, with no signal and no guarantee that I wouldn't run straight into whoever was stalking me, felt just as dangerous. The car was parked in the clearing, but to get to it, I'd have to step out into the open, turn my back on the trees, and hope nothing happened. I kept hesitating. The fourth night broke me. Started the same footsteps, slow, patient. But then came something new, tapping on the glass. The small window above the bed shook faintly as something tapped against it, again and again. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. My heart slammed in my chest so hard I thought it might burst. Then silence. I thought maybe they had left. I thought maybe the nightmare was over for the night. But then, through the thin wood, I heard breathing. Slow, steady breathing, just on the other side of the wall. I couldn't take it anymore. My body was shaking uncontrollably. I thought I might scream. Instead, I waited for the first trace of dawn, and then I made my move. I grabbed my bag, stuffed what little I had into it, and ran for the car. I didn't look around. I didn't stop to check the trees. I just sprinted, threw my things in, and started the engine. My hands were trembling so badly I almost dropped the keys. The road out felt endless, but I didn't stop. I didn't breathe until I hit pavement again and finally saw other cars on the highway. When I got home, I noticed something that made my skin crawl all over again. On the side of my bag, in faint smears of dirt, was the outline of a handprint. Large, too large to be mine. I realized then that whoever had been out there had gotten close enough to touch my things. Maybe even close enough to watch me while I slept, only a thin wall of wood between us. That was the end of it for me. I never went back. I never contacted the owner. I never told anyone the full story. But even now, when I close my eyes at night, I can still hear the sound of those slow footsteps circling in the dark. I had been looking forward to spending a few days alone in the small cabin I had rented deep in the woods. It sat at the edge of a quiet lake, far away from the nearest town, and I thought the silence would help me reset. I had been feeling burnt out from work and everything else piling up in my life, so being away from noise, people, and constant stress seemed perfect. The cabin was plain but solid, made of old wood with a metal roof, and it had just enough to live comfortably. An old stove for cooking, a wood-burning fireplace, a bed tucked against the wall, and shelves stocked with canned food that the owner had said I was free to use. I had brought some of my own supplies too, along with a cooler of meat and drinks, a flashlight, a lantern, and a few other essentials. The drive up the dirt road had already made it clear how isolated the place really was. The gravel path wound through thick woods, and once I parked and stepped out, I didn't hear another car, a plane, or even distant traffic. Just the sound of the wind moving through the trees and the water lapping lightly against the shore of the lake. I had thought it would feel relaxing, but standing there with my bags in my hands, it felt heavier than I expected, like the silence had a weight. I brushed it off, told myself it was just the adjustment, and went inside. The first night was uneventful. I cooked some food, read for a while, and sat by the fireplace until the flames burned down. The old wooden walls creaked as they settled, and sometimes I thought I heard something outside, but every time I looked through the window, all I saw was the dark outline of trees against the night sky. I locked the door before going to bed, more out of habit than fear, but I slept a little lighter than usual. Every sound seemed sharper, like I wasn't used to the way the woods moved at night. The next morning, I walked down by the lake with a thermos of coffee. The surface was completely still, smooth like glass, and mist floated just above it in a thin layer. I watched the mist drift and thought about how far I was from anyone else. It felt good, in a way, to know that I was truly alone. I walked along the shore, followed the tree line a bit, and then went back to the cabin to make breakfast. By the second night, I had started to settle into the routine. I kept the lantern nearby, added logs to the fire when needed, and listened to the forest as I lay in bed. But sometime around midnight, I woke up without knowing why. My eyes opened, and I stared into the dark ceiling beams. I could hear the faintest sound, something soft and uneven, like something brushing against the wall outside. I held still, listening, and then it stopped. I thought maybe it had been a branch moving in the wind, but the air was still. I waited a long time before falling back asleep. The following morning, I went outside to check. I walked around the cabin slowly, looking at the ground and the wooden walls. On the far side, I noticed something strange. The ground had patches of soft mud from where rainwater collected, and in it, I saw what looked like a shoe print. It wasn't very clear, but it didn't look like mine. It was longer, narrower, and angled differently. I crouched down, stared at it, and tried to reason with myself. Maybe it was an old print, left behind by the owner or someone else before me. The mud could have held it for days. Still, something about it bothered me. That night, I had a harder time sleeping. I kept thinking about the sound I had heard and the mark in the mud. I locked the door again and checked the windows to make sure they were closed. The lantern burned low on the table beside me as I tried to drift off. I eventually did, but around the same time as the night before, I woke again. This time, it wasn't brushing. It was a faint crunch, like a footstep on gravel. My body tensed, and I lay completely still. The sound came again, closer this time, then stopped. I could hear my own breathing, and I tried to make it quieter, as if whoever or whatever was outside could hear me too. Minutes passed. I didn't move. Then I heard the faintest creak from the porch, the sound of weight pressing on old wood. The door was locked, but the noise was too close. I reached slowly for the flashlight, switched it on, and pointed it at the door. The beam lit up the old wood and metal latch. I waited, my arms stiff, the light cutting through the room. Nothing moved. After a long time, I heard the creak again, this time fading as if the weight was lifted and whoever it was stepped back down into the dirt. When the sun came up, I forced myself to open the door and look around. The air was cold, and the ground was damp. I walked carefully around the cabin again. This time, I didn't just see one print in the mud. I saw several. They weren't fresh enough to be sharp, but they weren't washed out either. They circled part of the cabin and then disappeared back into the woods. My stomach tightened. It wasn't just an old print after all. Someone had been here. I thought about leaving that day, but I told myself it might just be some hunter or hiker passing by. Maybe they were curious, or maybe they had been trying to find shelter but left when they saw the cabin was already occupied. I tried to convince myself of that, but deep down I didn't believe it. That evening I stacked a few heavy logs near the door so that if anyone tried to open it, the noise would wake me. I also kept the flashlight and a kitchen knife next to the bed. I felt ridiculous, but I couldn't shake the unease. When I lay down, I stared at the ceiling again, waiting for the silence to break. It did. Not long after midnight, I heard the crunch of steps again, slow and deliberate. They circled the cabin, stopping and starting, as if whoever it was listening or checking. Then I heard scratching, like fingernails or metal brushing against the window frame. My chest tightened, and I stayed frozen in the bed. The lantern burned weakly on the table, casting just enough light to make the shadows thicker. The noises went on for what felt like hours. Sometimes it was the porch creaking, sometimes it was a thump against the wall. I kept waiting for the latch on the door to rattle, but it didn't. When it finally stopped, the silence was worse. I didn't sleep again until daylight. In the morning, I found more prints, fresher this time, right near the door. The logs I had stacked hadn't been moved, but one of the windows had smudges on the glass, like someone had pressed against it. I stared at the marks for a long time, trying to steady my breathing. I couldn't deny it anymore. Someone was coming to the cabin at night. They hadn't tried to break in yet, but they were watching, circling, waiting. I decided I would leave the next day, but I had one more night to get through. That whole day I felt jumpy, checking the windows, listening for anything in the woods. As night came, I didn't light the lantern. I sat in the dark instead, my back against the wall, the knife in my hand, and the flashlight beside me. I thought maybe if they believed I was asleep, I could catch them off guard. My heart beat hard in my chest as I waited. The steps came again, slow and steady. My eyes adjusted to the dark, and I could make out faint shapes beyond the glass. I couldn't see details, but I knew someone was there. The porch creaked. I gripped the knife tighter, every muscle in my body stiff. The sound stopped, and for a long stretch there was nothing. Then came the sound I had been dreading, the rattle of the door latch. It was faint, careful, like they were testing it. The wood groaned as the door shifted slightly against the stacked logs. I snapped the flashlight on and aimed it straight at the door. For a split second, I caught movement, a shape pulling back fast into the dark. I only saw part of it, enough to know it was a person. My chest pounded so hard I thought it might break. I kept the light on the door, waiting, but the creaks and crunches faded away into the trees. When the sun rose again, I packed everything I could into my bags. I didn't eat, didn't make coffee, didn't waste a second. I carried my stuff to the car, loaded it quickly, and started down the dirt road. My hands were shaking on the steering wheel. Every turn I expected to see someone step out onto the road, but it didn't happen. When I reached town, I stopped at a gas station and sat in the car for a long time, trying to calm down. My eyes burned from exhaustion, and my chest still felt tight. I thought about how close I had been, how someone had circled that cabin night after night, how they had tried the door while I sat just feet away holding a knife like it would have been enough. I realized how foolish I had been staying even after the first signs. I never went back to that cabin. I never even drove down that road again. The thought of it still makes my skin crawl. The prints in the mud, the smudges on the window, the creak of the porch under someone else's weight. They had been waiting for the right moment. If I had stayed one more night, I don't think I would have made it out. I had been planning the trip for weeks, maybe even months, without realizing how much thought I was putting into it. Life in the city had been draining me in ways that I couldn't put into words. Every morning I would wake up to the sound of traffic, horns, alarms, and neighbors fighting through the thin apartment walls. I had grown tired of staring at screens, tired of breathing in air that always felt heavy and dirty, tired of living in a place where I always felt like there were too many people but I was still alone. So when the chance came to borrow a small cabin deep in the woods from an old family acquaintance, I didn't hesitate. I wanted quiet, I wanted air that smelled like trees, and I wanted to be somewhere where no one could bother me. At least that was what I thought I wanted. The cabin was far off from the main roads. I had to drive nearly 3 hours into the hills before turning off onto a narrow dirt road that wound between tall pines and thick undergrowth. The road itself was rough, filled with stones and ruts that shook my car, and it made me nervous thinking how far I would be if I ever broke down. But at the same time, that was what I was chasing. Distance, silence, a place where the world felt slowed down. When I finally reached the cabin, it was smaller than I imagined. It was built from weathered logs, dark brown and gray from years of storms and sun. The roof sagged slightly in the middle, the front steps leaned to one side, and there were moss patches on the lower walls. But it looked solid enough, and it had a certain charm that only things left alone in the woods for decades seemed to have. There was no one else around. No other cabins, no distant houses. Just trees that seemed to grow endlessly in every direction. I unlocked the door with the key I had been given and stepped inside. The air smelled stale, like dust and old wood, but nothing rotten. The furniture was simple. An old table, a couple of chairs, a couch that looked like it had been bought in the 70s, and a bed in the back room. There was no electricity, no running water, and no cell service. I had been warned about that, but it didn't bother me at first. I had brought plenty of bottled water, food that didn't need refrigeration, a lantern, and a few extra flashlights with batteries. I wanted to disconnect, so being cut off seemed like part of the plan. The first day passed quietly. I unpacked, set things in their places, swept the floor, and made the cabin feel a little less abandoned. I walked the area around it, tracing small paths between trees, finding where the ground dipped into a stream about 100 yards from the back. The forest was alive with sound: birds, insects, the distant rush of wind through the treetops. When evening came, the quiet grew heavier. By the time darkness settled in, I realized how different it felt compared to the city. Out here, there were no lights on the horizon, no faint sound of traffic, no glow of street lamps, just complete blackness outside the window and silence so deep that every small creak inside the cabin felt louder. That first night, I found it hard to sleep. The woods were not as silent as I expected. There were cracks of branches, scurrying noises in the leaves, the occasional cry of some animal in the distance. Every sound made me freeze and listen. I told myself it was natural, that this was how the forest worked, but my body didn't relax easily. I lay on the bed with the lantern turned off, staring into the dark, ears straining. Eventually, exhaustion pulled me under. The next day, I decided to hike further to really explore the area. I packed a small bag with water, a snack, and my pocket knife. The air was cool but not cold, and the sky was clear. The trees grew dense, but there were faint trails, perhaps made by deer or other animals. I followed them for hours, always keeping track of my direction. The deeper I went, the more I noticed how the forest seemed to absorb sound. The further I walked, the less I could hear from behind me. At some point, even the breeze seemed to die down. I stopped once when I thought I heard footsteps behind me. They were faint, almost like mine echoing back, but the ground was soft, and echoes didn't exist here. I stood still, listening. The forest returned nothing but silence. I told myself it was just a deer or maybe my own paranoia, and I kept walking. But the feeling that something was moving where I couldn't see didn't leave me for the rest of the hike. When I finally made it back to the cabin, the relief was stronger than I expected. Felt like safety. I cooked some food over a small gas stove, ate slowly, and tried to enjoy the peace. But that night, the noises outside grew worse. There were heavier steps, not like small animals, but like something larger brushing through the undergrowth. I tried to ignore it, but at one point I was sure I heard something circling the cabin. Leaves crunching, then silence, then crunching again on the opposite side. I sat frozen in bed, gripping my flashlight, listening. It went on for nearly an hour before fading away. The following days blurred together. Each day I tried to distract myself with tasks: collecting firewood, cleaning the cabin, writing in a notebook I had brought. But each night the fear grew worse. The noises outside returned every evening, sometimes closer, sometimes further. Once I thought I saw movement between the trees just before dusk, a quick shape shifting back into shadow. Another night I heard what sounded like the door handle being brushed, just once, soft enough that I almost thought I imagined it. I began to dread sunset. My stomach would tighten as the sky darkened, and I would check every window, every lock, every crack. The cabin, which had felt like safety before, now felt fragile, like a box of thin wood that could be broken easily. One evening, I forced myself to investigate. When the noises began, I lit my lantern and opened the door just a crack. The night air was cold, and the forest outside was pitch black. I shone the light across the clearing, sweeping from tree to tree. At first I saw nothing. Then, just at the edge of the light, I thought I saw a figure. Tall, unmoving, half hidden behind a tree. My breath caught, and the lantern shook in my hand. When I blinked and looked again, it was gone. I closed the door and bolted it, heart pounding so hard I thought it would burst. The next morning, I found fresh prints in the dirt outside the cabin. They weren't boots, not shoes, but bare feet. Human, long-toed, pressed deep into the soil. They circled the cabin more than once, overlapping each other. I stood staring at them for a long time, stomach churning. I was miles from the nearest house, in the middle of nowhere, and yet someone had been walking barefoot around my cabin at night. I should have left that day, but I told myself I was overreacting. I convinced myself that maybe they were old, maybe from years back. I didn't want to believe the truth because leaving meant hiking out and driving alone through miles of dirt road, and part of me thought that was even more dangerous. so I stayed. That night, the sounds came again, louder than before. I heard dragging noises across the porch, a faint knock against the wall, and then silence that stretched for too long. I didn't sleep at all. I sat in the corner with my knife in my hand and the lantern burning until its fuel began to run low. Every minute stretched endlessly, and every small creak of the cabin made me flinch. The following morning, I stepped outside to find the prints again, this time fresher. The dirt still crumbled around the edges where the weight had pressed in. And worse, there were handprints on the window glass, smeared faintly as though someone had pressed their palms against it and dragged them downward. That was when I knew I had to leave. I stuffed everything back into my bag, grabbed my water, and locked the cabin behind me, even though it felt pointless. I began the long walk back to my car. The woods felt different now. Every sound snapped my head around. Every bush seemed like it was hiding someone crouched inside. I walked fast, too fast, tripping on roots, stumbling over rocks, but not stopping. When I finally saw the clearing where I had parked, my heart sank. The car's tires were slashed, flat and useless. The driver's side window was smashed. My supplies that I had left inside were gone. I stood there in shock, unable to process it. My only way out was ruined. I was deep in the woods with miles of dirt road ahead of me, and whoever had been circling the cabin clearly knew I was there and didn't want me leaving. The sun was already lowering. I had two choices: walk the entire way out through the night or go back to the cabin. Neither felt safe, but staying in the open felt worse. So I turned back. That night was the worst of them all. I didn't sleep. The noises came again, closer than ever. I heard scratching against the wood, slow and deliberate. I heard footsteps right on the porch. At one point, the door shook slightly, as if tested. I sat frozen with my knife clutched in my hand, waiting for the moment it would burst open. Hours dragged by like years. When dawn finally came, I stepped outside to find the doorframe marked with deep scratches. The footprints were everywhere, circling and circling. I knew I couldn't last another night. I packed only what I could carry easily and started walking. I didn't follow the road. I cut straight through the forest, hoping to find another. I had been planning the trip for weeks before I finally drove out there. The cabin was deep in the woods, far enough from town that I knew I wouldn't hear a single car once I turned off the main road. I wanted that kind of silence. I wanted to get away from everything for a while. The cabin belonged to a distant relative who rarely used it, and when I asked if I could stay for a week, they told me it was fine as long as I brought my own supplies. The drive itself took most of the afternoon. The highway was easy, but once I turned off onto the smaller roads, it felt like I was slipping into another world. The paved road narrowed, then turned to gravel and finally dirt. Trees lined both sides, leaning in close, blotting out most of the sky. My tires kicked up dust, and every bump and dip in the ground made me grip the steering wheel tighter. I kept glancing at the map I had printed, making sure I didn't miss the small turnoff that would lead to the cabin's driveway. When I finally saw the old wooden post with the faded red paint marking the entrance, I slowed down and turned in. The driveway was overgrown with weeds, and it looked like no car had driven up it in a long time. Branches scraped along the side of my truck as I eased forward, and after a short climb, the trees opened up just enough to reveal the cabin. It sat on a small clearing, the roof patched in a few places, the porch slanted slightly to the left. It wasn't falling apart, but it wasn't the kind of place you'd expect to see in a magazine either. The wood was dark with age, and the windows looked almost black from where I parked. There was a small shed about 20 feet to the right, with its roof sagging under a heavy coat of moss. The clearing itself was quiet, too quiet. I cut the engine and listened, and the silence seemed heavier than it should have been. No birds, no insects, just the sound of my own breathing. I unloaded my things: 2 large duffel bags of clothes and food, a cooler of drinks, and a box of tools and small supplies. I carried them inside, and the smell hit me right away. It was the smell of old wood, dampness, and dust. I set my bags down in the living room. The place had a stone fireplace, a worn-out couch, and a few shelves with jars that were probably older than I was. The air was stale, so I went around opening the windows to let in some fresh air. I checked the rooms, making sure everything was fine. There were 2 small bedrooms, each with a bed frame and a thin mattress. The bathroom was tiny, with an old sink and a shower that looked like it hadn't been used in years. The kitchen had a working stove, or at least it looked like it would work, though I wasn't sure if the gas line still had pressure. I had brought a small propane stove just in case. Once I settled in, I set up my supplies. I stacked canned food in the kitchen, put drinks in the cooler, and laid out my bedding in one of the bedrooms. The sun was already sinking, so I stepped outside to take a better look at the area while I still had light. The forest pressed in tight around the clearing, the tree line close and thick. The cabin sat in a kind of bowl, surrounded by taller ridges on 3 sides. I could see paths leading off into the woods, though none looked well-traveled. When the light started fading, I went back inside and lit a lantern. I had brought a few battery-powered ones, along with extra batteries. I ate a simple dinner of canned beans and bread, washed it down with water, and sat on the couch for a while. The silence in the cabin was strange. Every creak of the wood sounded too loud. When the wind moved through the trees outside, it felt like the sound crawled under the walls. That first night, I didn't sleep well. I lay in the bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to every small sound. Around midnight, I thought I heard something moving outside. It wasn't close, but it was steady, like the crunch of footsteps on dry leaves. My heart started pounding, and I lay perfectly still, straining my ears. After a while, the sound faded, and I convinced myself it was just a deer or maybe even the wind carrying noise in a strange way. I eventually drifted off to sleep, though it was shallow and restless. The next morning, I made coffee on the propane stove and tried to shake off the unease. The woods looked different in daylight. The clearing was brighter, and the trees didn't seem as close. I decided to walk the perimeter just to get a sense of the land. I found faint paths that led into the woods, but I didn't go too far. I marked a few trees with small strips of cloth so I wouldn't lose my bearings. Back at the cabin, I noticed something odd. Near the back wall, the dirt looked disturbed, like someone had walked there recently. The ground was soft, and I could make out impressions that didn't look like animal tracks. They weren't sharp enough to be clear footprints, but something about the way the soil was pressed down made my stomach tighten. I told myself it was old, maybe from my relative or someone else who had visited months ago, but the unease stuck with me. That day, I tried to keep busy. I chopped some firewood, cleaned dust out of the corners, and set up a small spot outside where I could sit in the sun. But all the while, I kept glancing at the tree line, half expecting to see someone standing there. No one ever was, but I couldn't shake the feeling. That night, the noises came again. This time, they were closer. I was sitting on the couch, reading by lantern light, when I heard the crunch of leaves. Slow, deliberate, not the random rustle of an animal. My chest tightened. I turned off the lantern, sat in the dark, and listened. The footsteps moved along the edge of the clearing, circling, then stopping. The silence after was worse than the sound itself. I sat frozen, barely breathing, until the night stretched on and I couldn't hear anything anymore. When morning came, I checked outside. I didn't see anything at first, but near the shed, the ground looked disturbed. The door to the shed was slightly open. I knew for sure I had seen it closed before. I walked over and pulled it shut, sliding the rusty latch into place. I didn't dare open it to check inside. Something about it felt wrong, like I'd be inviting trouble if I did. The following nights got worse. The noises weren't just footsteps anymore. Sometimes it sounded like something brushing against the cabin walls. Once, I thought I heard a faint tap on the window. Each time, I sat in silence, gripping the handle of the knife I kept next to me. I barely slept, my nerves stretched tight. By the 4th night, I was exhausted. I decided I would leave the next morning. Whatever peace I had come here to find wasn't worth this constant edge of fear. But that night, the worst came. It was past midnight when I heard the shed door creak open. My body went cold. I hadn't locked it with anything more than the latch, and it wasn't strong. The sound of the hinge groaning carried across the clearing. Then, footsteps again. Slow, steady, moving toward the cabin. I sat in the dark, holding the knife, every muscle in my body tight. The footsteps came right up to the porch. The boards creaked under the weight. I waited, my mouth dry, my heart slamming in my chest. The doorknob rattled softly at first, then harder. I gripped the knife so tight my hand ached. The knob turned, but the lock held. Whoever it was didn't try to break it. After a moment, the rattling stopped. Then came the sound of retreating footsteps, slow and heavy, moving back across the clearing, into the trees. I sat awake until dawn, staring at the door, afraid to even blink. When the sun rose, I packed everything as fast as I could. I didn't care about leaving some things behind. I loaded the truck, my hands shaking, and started the engine. As I backed up, I glanced toward the shed. The door was open again, wide this time, like something had forced it. I didn't stop to check. I drove down the driveway, branches scraping the sides of the truck, and didn't look back. By the time I reached the highway, I felt like I could breathe again. But even as I merged back onto the main road, a thought kept gnawing at me. Whoever had been there hadn't just stumbled across the cabin by accident. They had been watching, circling, waiting, and if I hadn't left that morning, I wasn't sure the door would have held another night. I never went back to that cabin. I had been looking forward to this trip for months. The cabin was deep in the woods, tucked away far from the main road, far from towns and far from people. That was the whole point. I wanted quiet, I wanted time to myself, and I wanted to feel like I was completely alone with nothing but the trees, the wind, and the sound of my own footsteps on the wooden floor. The drive there had already taken longer than I thought it would. The gravel road twisted endlessly through dense forest, climbing hills, cutting down into valleys, then climbing again. My car rattled the whole way. By the time I reached the clearing where the cabin sat, the sun had already started lowering behind the trees, giving the forest that dull orange glow where everything feels calmer but also a little more unsettled, like the day is about to close in on you. The cabin wasn't large, but it was more than enough for me. It had one bedroom, a small kitchen, a bathroom with an old water heater, and a living area with a fireplace that smelled faintly of smoke from past winters. There was a narrow porch out front and a shed about 20 feet behind it, sitting crooked and dark against the tree line. I hauled in my bags, set them down, and walked through each room, not out of excitement, but out of habit. I wanted to see every corner of the place I was going to be in, to know where every window was, how the doors closed, and how solid the locks felt. The forest was thick all around. Pines and oaks crowded so close together that looking past them felt impossible, like the trees were pressing into one another, blocking out whatever might be behind. I thought it was beautiful, quiet, almost too quiet. Even as I stood on the porch, I realized I didn't hear much of anything. No cars, no planes overhead, no distant hum of people. Just the faint movement of leaves and once in a while, the sharp crack of a branch snapping somewhere deeper inside the woods. That first night was calm. I unpacked a few things, cooked a simple meal, and sat in the wooden chair near the window to eat. Darkness came quickly out here, faster than I expected. When it fell hard. The woods outside became nothing but black shapes, and the cabin lights reflected back at me in the glass, blocking my view of what was outside. I went around checking the locks twice before I went to bed. I woke up around 2 in the morning to a sound. At first, I thought it was part of a dream, but as I lay still, I heard it again. A sharp crack, like a stick breaking under pressure. I held my breath and listened. It wasn't close. It wasn't right at the cabin, but it was close enough to reach my ears in the stillness. The woods are full of animals, I told myself. Deer moving through, maybe even a bear. I stayed awake a while longer, staring at the ceiling, waiting for more. Nothing came, and eventually I drifted back to sleep. The next morning was bright and cold. I stepped out onto the porch with a mug of coffee and looked at the ground around the cabin. My eyes caught something in the dirt near the shed. At first, I thought it was just animal prints, but the shape was wrong. The mud had held the impression of a boot sole, A person had been there, close enough to touch the back wall of the cabin if they wanted to. The print wasn't old either. It looked recent, edges still sharp. My chest tightened a little. There was no reason for anyone to be back here. The property was private, the road was barely usable, and there weren't hiking trails nearby. I stared at the print longer than I needed to, waiting for my mind to turn it into something else, but it didn't change. I forced myself to brush it off as maybe from before I arrived. Maybe a worker who maintained the cabin weeks ago. I tried to enjoy the day, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. Every time the woods went silent, I caught myself looking up, scanning the trees, wondering if someone was standing there watching me. I kept telling myself it was just in my head. That night, the sounds came again. More cracks, more movement. This time, it wasn't far. It was close enough that I sat up in bed, heart pounding, ears straining. The cabin was so quiet that every sound outside carried through the walls. There was a heavy thump, like something solid hitting the ground. My throat went dry. I wanted to get up and look out the window, but at the same time, I didn't want to draw attention to myself. I sat still in the bed, barely breathing, until the noise faded. Eventually, it went silent. I don't think I slept much after that. By the third day, I was jumpy. I told myself it was nothing, but my body didn't believe it. Every shadow looked wrong. Every sound pulled my attention. I went for a short walk, staying close to the cabin, and when I circled back, I noticed something that froze me in place. On the porch railing, just at the edge of the steps, was a mark. A fresh scratch, cut clean into the wood, angled like someone had run a knife across it. I stared at it for a long time, my mouth dry, before finally stepping inside and locking the door behind me. That night, the noises didn't just stay in the distance. They came closer, the sound of footsteps, steady, deliberate, moving through the leaves. My heart hammered against my chest. I sat in the dark with the lights off, gripping the flashlight I had packed. I didn't turn it on. I didn't want to show where I was. The steps circled the cabin slowly. I could hear them pause, then start again. I froze in place, afraid to even shift my weight. My ears rang from the blood rushing through them. After what felt like forever, the steps faded away. I stayed awake until morning. When the light came, I stepped outside and walked the perimeter. There were footprints everywhere now. Clear, fresh ones in the soft dirt around the cabin. They weren't mine. They circled the structure, some pressed closer to the walls, as if whoever made them had been leaning in, maybe looking inside. I thought about leaving right then, packing my bag, getting in the car, and driving away. But the cabin was far from the road, the gravel path long and rough. If someone was in the woods watching, I would have to load my car in full view of them, turn my back, and then crawl slowly over the uneven road before I could even reach the highway. The thought of being out in the open like that made my skin crawl. I told myself I'd leave in the morning, in daylight. Felt safer that way. That evening, I stacked furniture against the door. I shut every curtain tight and kept all the lights off. I sat in the corner with a kitchen knife beside me, waiting. My body ached from tension, my head pounding, eyes fixed on the shadows stretching across the floor. Hours dragged by in silence. Then, sometime after midnight, a sound cut through the air so sharp it made me flinch. The sound of the back door handle being tested. Slow, deliberate pressure, metal clicking softly as it moved. My heart slammed against my ribs. The handle jiggled again, harder this time. I gripped the knife tighter, hands slick with sweat. The sound stopped. Then came footsteps across the porch, slow and heavy. They moved to the window. I could hear the faint creak of the wooden boards as weight shifted. For a moment, I thought I saw a shadow cross the crack in the curtain, but I didn't dare move to check. My chest burned from holding my breath. Minutes dragged on like hours. Every second stretched until I thought I'd go mad. Then, as quietly as it began, it stopped. The woods swallowed everything again. By morning, I knew I couldn't stay another night. I packed quickly, stuffing my things into bags without care. My hands shook as I carried them to the car, eyes darting constantly to the tree line. Every sound made me whip my head around. The forest felt alive, like it was holding its breath, waiting for me to make a mistake. I threw the last bag into the car, slid into the seat, and locked the doors. As I drove down the long gravel road, I checked the mirror again and again. The trees bent and swayed in the wind, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was there, standing just beyond the edge, watching me leave. When I finally reached the main road, relief washed over me so hard I nearly laughed out loud. But it wasn't over. When I pulled into my driveway hours later, exhausted and worn down, I stepped out of the car and froze. On the back bumper, carved deep into the metal, was the same mark I had seen on the cabin railing. A sharp, angled scratch. That was the moment I understood. Whoever had been out there hadn't just stayed in the woods. They had gotten close enough to touch my car, maybe even followed me part of the way. I wasn't safe just because I had left the cabin. They knew where I lived now, and from that day on, I never felt alone again, no matter where I was. I had been planning the cabin trip for months. It was not a vacation in the usual sense. It was more of a break from the constant noise of the city, from the traffic, the screens, the constant ringing of my phone, and the people who always seemed to need something from me. I rented a small log cabin deep in the northern woods, the kind of place that was shown in pictures online with tall pines surrounding it and a narrow gravel path that was hardly more than 2 ruts carved into the earth by truck tires. The cabin was old but seemed sturdy, with a tin roof and a stone fireplace. There was a small clearing around it, but beyond that the trees closed in thick, tall, and endless. I went alone, which in itself was probably not the smartest decision. Most people prefer to take friends or family to a place like that, but I wanted the quiet. I wanted to wake up and not hear anyone moving in the next room, not hear a car starting, not hear voices outside my door. The first day I arrived, it was late afternoon. The sky was already changing, the shadows stretching long between the trees. I unloaded my small cooler, my duffel bag, and the few supplies I brought. Inside, the cabin smelled of wood and dust. It had been shut for months, maybe longer, but it was not dirty. There was a table, 2 chairs, a small bed with a thin mattress, and shelves with some old pans and plates. The silence was what struck me most. When I stepped outside after dropping my things inside, the air was still. No traffic in the distance, no neighbors, no airplanes overhead. Just the occasional rustle of the wind through the trees. It was exactly what I wanted. The first night was uneventful. I made a simple dinner from what I had packed, lit a lantern, and sat at the table until it got late. When I finally lay down, the darkness was thick, deeper than what I was used to in the city. I could hear every creak of the cabin walls, every pop from the firewood settling in the fireplace. But I was not afraid. It felt peaceful, in a way that only comes when you are far away from everything. The second day I explored. I walked down the dirt road, finding that it stretched for a long way through the woods, winding and uneven. The trees pressed close on either side. I found a stream about a mile away, where the water ran cold and clear over smooth stones. I filled a bottle there and sat for a while, just listening to the water. That night, though, something changed. I woke up around 2 in the morning. It was the kind of waking where you are not sure what pulled you out of sleep. I lay still, listening. At first, it was only the usual sounds, the faint movement of the trees outside, the distant cry of some night bird. Then I thought I heard something else, a crunch of leaves, slow, deliberate, not the random scatter of an animal moving quickly, but the steady weight of footsteps. I stayed still, my breathing quiet. The footsteps came closer, then stopped. The silence after that felt heavier. I did not move for a long time, just staring at the ceiling, waiting. Eventually, after what felt like forever, I heard them again. Fainter now, moving away into the trees. I told myself it was probably a deer, maybe an elk, though I had never heard them move quite like that. The next morning, I looked outside. The ground around the cabin was a mix of pine needles and dirt, but near the edge of the clearing, I saw impressions. Not clear prints, but enough to tell me something large had passed through during the night. I bent down and studied them, trying to decide if they were animal tracks. They were too vague to be sure. I tried to push it out of my mind, but I could not shake the unease. The woods no longer felt as friendly as before. On the third day, I walked a little further along the road, carrying a small pack. The sun was bright, and the air was warm, but the trees kept the ground in shadow. After about 2 miles, I noticed something strange. On the side of the road, deeper in the trees, there was a structure. Not a cabin like mine, but what looked like the remains of a shelter. Old boards, a rusted metal barrel, and a frame that might have once been part of a roof. I moved closer, curiosity pushing me forward. It looked abandoned for years, the wood blackened from rot, the barrel full of rainwater. But there were signs of more recent use. Around the shelter were cut logs stacked in a pile, not old, not weathered. Nearby, a fire pit with ashes that were not too old. Someone had been there. I stood looking at it for a while, then turned back toward the road. Suddenly, I did not feel like being far from the cabin. That night, I could not sleep. I lay in bed, listening again. Around midnight, I heard the footsteps once more. This time, I was certain. They were human. Slow, steady, moving just beyond the cabin walls. I held my breath, my ears straining. The steps circled part of the cabin, then stopped. I imagined someone standing just beyond the wall, listening, waiting. My chest tightened. I reached for the flashlight I kept near the bed and held it, though I did not turn it on. After a long time, the sound faded. I did not sleep the rest of the night. In the morning, I went outside again. Near the back wall of the cabin, I found more impressions in the dirt. Clearer this time. A boot print, not an animal. I felt the first real wave of fear then. I was miles from anyone, no cell service, no neighbors. The nearest small town was at least an hour away by car. If someone was out here, watching me, I had no way to call for help. The next day, I tried to stay busy. I chopped some wood, boiled water, kept the fire going. But I kept looking toward the trees, half expecting to see someone there. I thought about leaving early, but part of me resisted. I told myself maybe it was a hunter, someone passing by. Maybe they did not even care about me. But deep down, I knew that was not right. The way the footsteps lingered, the way they circled, it was not by accident. That night, I stayed awake. I kept the lantern low and sat at the table, listening. Around 1, it started again. The crunch of boots in the leaves. This time, I forced myself to move quietly to the window. I pulled back the curtain just enough to see outside. In the clearing, near the edge of the trees, a man stood. He was tall, with broad shoulders, wearing a dark jacket and a hat pulled low. I could not see his face in the darkness, but I could see how still he stood, just facing the cabin. Not moving, not making a sound, just standing there. My hands shook. I let the curtain fall back and stepped away from the window. My chest pounded so hard I thought he would hear it. I sat back down at the table, gripping the flashlight like a weapon, and waited. He did not come closer. He did not move. I sat for hours, too scared to check again. When the first light of dawn came, I finally dared to look. He was gone. The next morning, I decided I had to leave. I packed my things quickly, shoving them into my bag. I loaded the car and started it, the sound of the engine breaking the heavy silence. I drove fast down the dirt road, checking the rearview mirror constantly. The road seemed longer than before, twisting endlessly through the trees. Every shadow felt like it hid someone. When I finally reached the main highway, I did not stop. I drove until I reached town, until I saw people, lights, movement. Only then did I pull over. For a long time, I sat in the car, trying to calm down. I kept seeing that figure in my mind, the way he stood in the clearing without moving. He had not spoken, had not come closer, but the way he watched was worse than anything else. I never went back to the cabin. I drove up to the cabin thinking I would finally have a quiet week away from everything. It was deep in the woods, far from the main road, the kind of place where you lose phone service miles before you even get close. The drive itself was already uneasy. The gravel road wound through thick trees that looked darker the further I went. The cabin wasn't much. just an old wooden structure with a tin roof and a small porch. It looked like it had been sitting there for decades, with weather-worn planks and a faint lean to one side. I unloaded my bag and supplies, carrying everything inside. The place smelled of old wood and dust. The furniture was basic: a small table, 2 chairs, a narrow bed with a thin mattress, and a fireplace that hadn't been used in a long time. There was a small kitchen area, but it was just a sink, a counter, and a couple of cabinets. I checked the cabinets and found a few old canned goods that looked like they had been there for years. I had brought enough food, so I didn't think much about it. The first night started normal. I lit a lantern, cooked a simple meal, and sat at the table listening to the silence. The woods were quiet, so quiet that I could hear the faint ticking of the lantern and the sound of my own breathing. Later, when I lay in bed, I kept listening to the silence. Usually, when camping or staying in the woods, you hear insects, birds, or at least the wind moving through the trees. But that night, there was nothing, just stillness. It made it hard to sleep. I stayed awake longer than I should have, staring at the dark ceiling and straining to hear anything at all. I must have fallen asleep sometime past midnight, because I woke up hours later to a faint sound outside. It wasn't loud, just a subtle crunch, like something stepping on dry leaves. I froze and listened, telling myself it could be a deer or some small animal. The sound came again, slow and deliberate. Then it stopped. I didn't move. The cabin felt colder, and I pulled the blanket tighter around me, staring at the faint shape of the window. Nothing else happened, but I couldn't fall back asleep for a long time. The next morning, I convinced myself it was nothing. I went outside, walked around the cabin, and looked at the ground. The earth was soft and uneven with old leaves and pine needles scattered around. I thought I saw something like a footprint near the edge of the trees, but it wasn't clear enough to be sure. Could have been anything. I brushed it off and spent the day chopping wood, tidying the cabin, and exploring a little down the trail. By evening, though, the uneasy feeling returned. As the light faded, the woods around me seemed to grow heavier, like they were pressing in on the cabin. I ate dinner quickly and sat by the small fire I had started in the fireplace. I kept glancing at the window, half expecting to see something moving outside. When I finally went to bed, I pushed a chair against the door, not because I thought it would stop anyone, but because it gave me a little comfort. That night I woke again, this time to a clearer sound. It was the sound of someone brushing against the side of the cabin. A soft scrape, like a hand or shoulder sliding along the wood. My chest tightened as I lay there in the dark, not moving, barely breathing. The sound moved slowly along the wall, then stopped near the back of the cabin. For a long moment there was nothing, and then I heard it again. Steps in the leaves moving away. I didn't sleep much after that. In the morning, I walked around the cabin again. On the back wall, I noticed fresh marks in the dirt, like something had been dragged. I followed it a little way into the trees, but it faded quickly into the forest floor. I stopped and turned back, feeling exposed, the silence of the woods pressing down on me again. That day, I couldn't focus on anything. I kept listening, waiting for sounds that weren't there. Every small creak of the cabin made me stiffen. I considered leaving, but I told myself I was just letting my mind run wild. The place was old, the woods were full of animals, and I was alone. That was all. Still, by the time the sun set, I was already dreading the night. When darkness came, I tried to stay awake by reading an old magazine I found in the cabin, but my eyes grew heavy. Sometime past midnight, I woke again, this time to a sharper noise. A knock, not loud, but distinct. One single knock on the door. My heart raced as I lay frozen. Then silence. I kept staring at the door, waiting. Minutes passed. Then came another knock, softer, almost careful. I stayed still, gripping the blanket in both hands, staring into the dark. The knocking didn't continue. After what felt like hours, I finally drifted into a restless sleep. In the morning, I felt drained. I went outside again, looking around for signs of anyone. On the porch, I noticed something new. On the far side, near the steps, there was a small piece of rope lying in the dirt. Old, frayed, about a foot long. I hadn't seen it before. I picked it up, then quickly dropped it, a wave of unease running through me. I told myself again I should leave, but leaving meant loading the truck and driving down miles of rough road, and for some reason, I hesitated. I think part of me wanted to prove it was nothing. That evening, I kept the lantern burning longer, its small glow pushing back the heavy dark. When I finally tried to sleep, it was harder than ever. My mind wouldn't quiet down. Then, in the middle of the night, I heard it again, the sound of steps in the leaves. Slow, steady, moving closer. This time, instead of stopping, the sound circled the cabin. I could follow it with my ears as it went around the walls. My whole body tensed as I lay still, gripping the blanket, staring at the ceiling. The steps paused at the door. Then I heard a faint rattle, like the handle being tested. I held my breath, every muscle tight. After a long moment, the sound moved again, back around the cabin, and then faded into the woods. By morning, I had made up my mind. I wasn't staying another night. I packed my bag quickly, loading everything into the truck. As I carried the last load outside, I stopped cold. On the porch, in front of the door, was something new. A small bundle of sticks, tied together with a piece of rope. The same frayed kind I had found before. It hadn't been there when I first stepped out. My chest tightened. Someone had been here and not just walking by. They had been right at the door while I slept. I threw the bundle into the woods, climbed into the truck, and started the engine. As I drove down the long road, I kept checking the mirrors, half expecting to see someone step out onto the trail behind me. I didn't stop until I reached the main road miles away, where I finally got phone service again. I didn't go back to that cabin. I told myself I would never go back. Whatever was out there, it wasn't in my head. Someone had been watching me, circling the cabin, leaving things behind. I didn't wait to find out what they wanted. That was the last time I stayed alone in a cabin in the woods. I had decided to spend a week alone in a cabin deep in the woods, far away from everything. The cabin belonged to a friend of a friend, and he told me it was quiet, private, and perfect for someone like me who wanted time alone. I had been living in the city for years, with constant noise, crowded streets, and stress that never seemed to end. My life had been running in circles, and I thought being away from everyone for a while would help clear my mind. I brought food, water, and enough supplies to last me more than a week. I made sure my car was filled with gas before I left, because the cabin was about 30 miles from the nearest town, hidden at the end of a rough dirt road that wound through thick trees and hills. The drive out there already felt unsettling. The farther I went, the more the paved road narrowed, until it turned into gravel, and then into a dirt trail with tire grooves pressed deep into the earth. Branches hung low, brushing against my car as I drove. The trees closed in on both sides until I felt like I was moving through a tunnel made of wood and leaves. I had no cell signal, which I expected, but it still made me uneasy knowing that I was completely cut off. When I reached the cabin, it looked smaller than I had imagined. It sat in a small clearing, surrounded by tall pines and thick undergrowth. The wood was old and weathered, gray from years of sun and rain. The windows were small and the roof sagged slightly, but it looked strong enough to hold. There was a narrow porch with 2 steps leading up to the door, and a stack of chopped firewood sat neatly by the side. There were no neighbors, no roads, nothing. Just the cabin and the forest stretching endlessly in every direction. Inside, the cabin was simple but comfortable. One main room with a bed in the corner, a small wood stove, a table with 2 chairs, and shelves lined with old canned food and tools. The air smelled like wood smoke and damp earth. Dust floated in the light that came through the windows. I walked through slowly, getting used to the silence. Outside, the world was still. No cars, no voices, no hum of electricity. Only the sound of the wind moving through the trees. The first day felt peaceful. I unpacked my things, set up my food on the shelves, and carried in more firewood to be sure I had enough. I checked the small outhouse behind the cabin, which looked stable though old. I walked around the clearing, looking at the tree line, noticing how quickly the forest swallowed up the light. By evening, the air grew colder, and the woods became darker than I had ever seen before. The night came fast, and when it came, it was absolute. There were no lights in the distance, no glow from houses or cars, nothing but blackness pressing in from every side. I lit a lantern and sat at the table, eating a simple meal. The quiet was heavy, broken only by the crack of the wood stove. I had brought a book, but I found it hard to read. I kept pausing, listening. Every small sound seemed louder here. The creak of the cabin's walls, the rustle of branches outside, the distant cry of an animal. I told myself I would get used to it, that the first night was always the hardest in a new place. That night, I lay in bed, staring at the wooden ceiling. The mattress was thin, but I was tired from the drive. I tried to focus on the warmth of the blankets and the steady crackle from the stove. At some point, I drifted off to sleep. I woke suddenly in the middle of the night. At first, I didn't know what had pulled me out of sleep, but then I heard it, a sound outside. It wasn't an animal. It was too steady, too heavy. It sounded like footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving through the leaves around the cabin. My heart started pounding as I lay still, holding my breath. The steps crunched closer, then stopped. The silence was worse than the sound. I stared toward the window, but all I could see was my reflection in the glass. Minutes passed. I tried to convince myself it was a deer or maybe a bear, but deep down I knew it wasn't. Bears moved differently, and deer were quicker. This sounded like someone walking. Eventually, the sound faded away into the woods. I didn't sleep again for the rest of the night. I lay awake, listening to every creak and whisper, waiting for it to return. When morning came, I stepped outside cautiously. The clearing looked normal, bathed in pale sunlight. The grass was damp with dew. I walked around the cabin, looking for tracks. In the dirt near the porch, I saw them. Footprints. Human footprints. The mud was soft enough to hold the shape of a boot sole, and they led from the tree line toward the cabin, then back into the woods. I stood staring at them for a long time, my stomach tight. Someone had been here, walking around my cabin in the middle of the night. I tried to calm myself. Maybe it was a hunter or someone passing through the woods. But the cabin was miles from any trail, and the prints had come straight out of the forest, not from a path. Whoever it was had no reason to be here, and that thought gnawed at me. I thought about leaving, but I had planned this trip for weeks. I told myself I was being paranoid, that the person was probably gone now. Still, I couldn't shake the unease. The second night was worse. As soon as the sun went down, the dark seemed heavier, pressing against the windows. I kept the lantern burning and sat by the stove, trying to distract myself. I kept glancing at the door, checking the lock even though I knew it was secure. Around midnight, I heard it again. Footsteps. This time they came closer, circling the cabin slowly. My chest tightened as I realized the sound was deliberate, like whoever it was wanted me to know they were there. I sat frozen in the chair, gripping the lantern, listening to the crunch of leaves move around me. At one point, I heard the porch creak. They were standing right outside the door. The sound lingered for what felt like hours before finally fading into the distance. I stayed awake until morning again, barely moving, barely breathing. When light returned, I checked outside. More footprints, fresh ones, circling the cabin, leading up to the porch, right to the door. My hands shook as I traced them with my eyes. Whoever it was had come back closer this time. I knew then that this wasn't random. Someone was watching me. The days that followed blurred together. I tried to act normal, cooking meals, chopping wood, walking the edge of the clearing. But the sense of being watched never left me. I avoided going too far into the trees, afraid of what I might see, or who might see me. Every night, the footsteps returned. Sometimes closer, sometimes farther, but always there. Always circling, always waiting. I never heard a voice, never saw a face, but I felt the presence pressing in on me. By the fifth night, I was unraveling. I hadn't slept in days, my eyes burned, and every noise sent my heart racing. That night, the footsteps came earlier, before I had even tried to sleep. I sat in the corner of the cabin, clutching the lantern, while the sound of boots scraped over the porch again and again. At one point, the doorknob rattled, just slightly, as if someone was testing it. I held my breath, staring at the door, waiting for it to burst open, but it never did. Eventually, the sound moved away again, leaving me in silence that felt almost worse. By morning, I couldn't take it anymore. I gathered my things quickly, shoving food back into bags, pulling on my jacket with shaking hands. I stepped outside, scanning the trees, but everything was still. I hurried to my car, loaded it, and started the engine. The sound of it filled me with relief. I turned onto the dirt road, driving as fast as I could without losing control. As I drove away, I looked in the rearview mirror. For a moment, I thought I saw movement at the edge of the clearing, just a dark figure standing between the trees watching. But when I blinked, it was gone. I didn't stop driving until I reached the paved road, and then the town. Only then did I feel like I could breathe again. I never went back to that cabin. I never asked my friend about it, and I never wanted to know who had been out there watching me. All I knew was that I had been alone in the woods, and someone else had been there too, moving in the darkness, waiting night after night. And that thought has never left me. I had been looking forward to a quiet weekend at the cabin for months. The place was old, small, and tucked far back in the woods, nearly a half-hour drive from the nearest paved road. I liked it that way because it gave me the feeling of being cut off from everything, away from the noise and problems of life. I had bought the cabin a few years earlier, mostly as a retreat. It wasn't fancy, just a single-story wooden place with one bedroom, a small kitchen, a narrow bathroom, and a sitting area with a wood stove. There was no phone service out there, no internet, and no neighbors for miles. That isolation was what usually made it peaceful, but it was also the very thing that would later make it frightening. When I arrived that Friday afternoon, the air was cooler than I expected. The season was shifting into fall, and the trees that surrounded the cabin had started to turn. Orange and red leaves scattered across the dirt driveway as I parked my truck near the front steps. I carried my bags inside, set my cooler down on the kitchen counter, and took a deep breath. It smelled like old wood, pine, and the faint smoky scent that always lingered in the walls from the wood stove. I unpacked slowly, putting a few clothes in the dresser, stacking canned food in the cupboard, and leaving my boots by the door. The silence out there was heavy but calming. All I could hear was the wind moving through the trees and the occasional creak of the cabin settling. The first couple of hours passed the way they usually did when I stayed there. I gathered some firewood from the stack I had left under the overhang and brought it inside to warm the place later that night. I filled a pot with water from the pump, lit a lantern as the daylight started to fade, and sat by the window just watching the woods. By the time the sky grew dark, the temperature dropped quickly. I made a fire in the stove, the crackling filling the room with a sound that was both comforting and alive. I ate a simple dinner from a can, sat back in the chair, and let the warmth sink into my bones. It should have been a normal night. It should have stayed quiet and uneventful, the way my cabin weekends usually were. But sometime after midnight, I woke up to a sound that didn't belong. At first, I thought it was the fire settling, the wood shifting inside the stove. Then I realized it was something outside. A crunch. A slow, deliberate step on the gravel of the driveway. My eyes opened wide in the dark, and I held my breath. Another crunch followed, closer this time, as if someone or something was walking toward the cabin. I froze in bed, straining to hear. The sound of footsteps stopped for a moment, replaced by silence so thick it pressed against my ears. Then came a faint scrape along the porch, like a shoe dragging lightly over the wooden boards. My mouth went dry. The cabin was remote. No one came out here unannounced. There was no reason for anyone to be near my place in the middle of the night. The nearest neighbor was miles away, and the road ended at my cabin. Whoever it was had come here deliberately. I stayed in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening. The scrape was followed by the faint creak of a board near the front door. Someone was standing on the porch. My heart pounded so hard I could hear the blood rushing in my ears. I waited, expecting maybe a knock, maybe a voice calling out, but nothing came. Just the slow shift of weight on the wooden boards outside, followed by silence again. After what felt like forever, I heard the crunch of gravel retreating, fading slowly until the woods swallowed it. I lay there for hours, unable to sleep, staring into the dark and waiting for another sound. By morning, nothing looked out of place. The sunlight made the cabin seem normal again, safe even, but my nerves stayed tight. I stepped out onto the porch carefully, scanning the driveway. The gravel looked slightly disturbed, but I couldn't be sure. I checked the trees at the edge of the clearing, half expecting to see someone standing there, but there was nothing, just leaves moving in the breeze. I told myself it might have been an animal, maybe a deer, though deep down I knew the steps had been too heavy, too deliberate. Still, I forced myself to move on. I made coffee, walked around the cabin once, and tried to shake it off. But the feeling of being watched clung to me. That day, I didn't wander far. Normally, I would hike down to the creek or chop some extra firewood, but instead I stayed close. I wanted the cabin in sight at all times. The woods seemed different now. Every sound of a branch breaking or leaves crunching made me turn my head. By afternoon, I felt trapped between wanting to pack up and leave and not wanting to let fear push me out of my own place. I convinced myself to stay another night, but I prepared differently. I locked the doors, checked the windows twice, and set a heavy hatchet within reach near the bed. When night came, the air grew colder, and the forest outside seemed to swallow all sound. The fire in the stove was the only light in the room, casting shadows that moved against the walls. I tried to read, tried to distract myself, but I couldn't focus. Every creak of the cabin made me sit up straight, listening. Hours passed slowly, and eventually, against my will, I dozed off in the chair. A noise woke me, not footsteps this time, but the unmistakable rattle of the front doorknob. My heart slammed against my ribs as I sat perfectly still, the book sliding silently off my lap. The metal knob twisted once, twice, as if someone was testing it. Locked. They stopped for a moment. Then the sound of a slow, dragging step moved across the porch again. My breathing felt too loud, so I pressed my lips shut, forcing myself to take shallow breaths through my nose. The steps circled the cabin, moving past the windows. I could hear them brushing against the siding now and then, slow and deliberate, like they wanted me to know they were there. I stayed frozen until the steps finally faded again into the woods. But this time, I knew they hadn't left. I couldn't explain how, but I felt it. Whoever it was hadn't gone far. They were close, maybe just beyond the trees, waiting. The hours until dawn stretched endlessly. When the first light finally touched the windows, I checked outside again. No footprints stood out in the gravel, but I could see where leaves had been disturbed near the tree line, pressed down as if someone had stood there for a long time. I didn't eat breakfast. I didn't even make coffee. My only thought was leaving. I started throwing my things into my bag and loading the truck. The whole time, I kept glancing at the woods, half expecting to see someone watching me. When I finally got behind the wheel, the relief was overwhelming. I turned the key and the engine roared to life. But as I looked up at the tree line one last time, I saw movement. Just for a second, a shape between the trunks. Tall, still, watching. My stomach dropped, and I drove out fast, gravel kicking up behind me. On the long drive back to town, I kept checking the rearview mirror, but the road stayed empty. It wasn't until I pulled into my driveway at home hours later that I finally felt like I could breathe. I knew one thing for certain. Someone had been out there at the cabin, and they had come back 2 nights in a row. They hadn't knocked, hadn't called out, hadn't done anything but circle the place and test the door. That meant their reason for being there wasn't good. I never spent another night in that cabin. A week later, I drove back in the daylight, packed everything I owned, and sold the place within the month. I told myself it wasn't worth wondering who it was or what they wanted. But sometimes at night, when the house is quiet, I think back to that sound of footsteps circling the walls, and I wonder how close they really came while I was sleeping. I never thought I would spend so much time remembering every small detail about a place I only stayed in for a few days. But what happened to me in that cabin has never left my mind. It is the kind of memory that burns itself into every corner of your brain, so even years later you can recall the exact smell of the wood, the sound of the floor under your boots, the shape of the shadows when the lantern light hit the walls. I had rented the cabin for a short break, thinking I needed some time away from noise, from people, from phones and traffic and the constant weight of other voices. I wanted silence. I wanted to hear nothing but trees moving in the wind and my own steps on the dirt. The cabin itself sat deep in the forest, far enough that the dirt road leading to it narrowed until only one vehicle could fit. There were no other houses around, no neighbors, no little shops or gas stations. The nearest town was more than an hour away. That isolation was part of the reason I had chosen it. The listing online had described it as perfect for hunters, hikers, or anyone seeking total peace. The photos had shown a one-room wooden structure with a small porch, a fire pit outside, and a trail disappearing behind it into heavy woods. It seemed simple but solid. When I arrived, the place looked smaller than the pictures, but it was still what I expected. It had a steep roof, weathered logs, and a heavy door that looked older than everything else. The windows were small and square, with wooden shutters. Inside, the cabin smelled of old pine mixed with dust. The floor creaked when I stepped in. The main room held a bed pushed against one wall, a little iron stove, a rough wooden table, and a few mismatched chairs. There was a shelf with some canned food, though I had brought my own supplies. There was no running water, no electricity. The owner had told me in the rental agreement that there was a hand pump outside for water and propane lanterns inside. First, it was exactly what I had wanted. The first night, I cooked a simple meal on the stove, sat at the table with a lantern, and listened to the quiet. The silence was not total. Nothing in the woods is ever truly quiet. I could hear branches rubbing against each other, an occasional owl, the wind moving across the roof. But compared to the noise of the city, it felt like a deep, heavy silence, the kind that presses against your ears until you feel alone in a way you didn't know was possible. I slept well that first night, wrapped in heavy blankets, listening to the distant crack of branches outside. The second day, I spent walking the trails around the cabin. The forest was dense, filled with pines and firs, with the ground covered in needles. The air smelled sharp and cold. I carried a pack with some water, jerky, and a small folding knife, though I never expected to need it. I stayed out for hours, wandering until the shadows grew long and I had to find my way back. By the time I returned, I was tired and ready to sit by the fire. Again, the night passed without trouble. It was the third day when I started to notice things. They weren't big things, just little details that felt off. When I walked the trail that afternoon, I saw boot prints in the dirt. At first, I thought they were my own from the day before, but when I checked, I realized they were fresher, pressed deeper in the damp soil and going in a different direction. I hadn't seen another person since I arrived. The tracks were from heavy boots, larger than mine, and they cut across the trail and disappeared into the brush. I told myself it was nothing, maybe a hunter, maybe someone passing through. It was public land, after all. Still, I couldn't help but notice how close they had been to the cabin. That night, I tried to ignore it. I cooked again, wrote in the small notebook I had brought, and read by lantern light. The wind pushed against the shutters, and at one point I thought I heard something move on the porch. The sound was soft, like weight shifting on old boards. I froze, holding my breath, the lantern flickering on the table. I waited, listening so hard my ears rang. After a long stretch of silence, I told myself it must have been the wind or maybe an animal. I forced myself to lie down, though I didn't sleep as well. Every crack of the wood, every shift of the cabin in the cold made me tense. The fourth day, I pumped water from the well and saw something that made me uneasy. The pump handle was wet even though I hadn't touched it yet, and there were damp boot prints in the dirt nearby. They were not mine. They led from the pump toward the trees and faded into the needles. The prints were wide and deep, the kind left by someone heavy. I stood there for a long time, staring at them, holding the bucket of water in my hand. I felt exposed, as if eyes were on me from the tree line, though I saw nothing. Inside the cabin, I kept checking the door, the windows, the shutters. I found myself looking at the corners of the room, expecting to see something that wasn't there. I ate little that day, my stomach tight with nerves. When night came, I pushed one of the chairs under the door handle. It felt ridiculous, like something out of a cheap story, but I did it anyway. I sat awake for hours, the lantern low, listening. At some point, I drifted into a half-sleep. A sound woke me. It was faint but sharp, metal against wood. I sat up, heart pounding. It came again, the soft scrape of metal, like a knife or tool brushing against the cabin wall. I stared at the door, but the sound was to the side, near one of the windows. Couldn't breathe. The sound dragged slowly, then stopped. Silence followed, heavy and endless. I gripped the blanket in my fists until my arms shook. Eventually, I must have drifted into uneasy sleep, because the next thing I knew, the light was gray and morning had come. I went outside and walked slowly around the cabin. On the far wall, near one of the windows, I saw it. A long mark in the wood, carved shallow into the log. It was not an accident. It was a straight line, about a foot long, as if someone had dragged a blade across it. I stared at it until I felt sick. Whoever had made the boot prints had been right there, inches from where I had been lying inside. From that moment, I could not shake the feeling of being watched. The forest, which had seemed peaceful before, now felt hostile. Every tree seemed to hide a figure. Every noise seemed deliberate. I kept expecting to see someone step out from the shadows, but no one did. The next night was worse. I barely slept, lying awake with the lantern burning low. Around midnight, I heard it again, the sound of weight on the porch boards. A slow, deliberate step, then another. I held my breath, my body rigid. The steps stopped right outside the door. I could hear the faint creak of the wood under pressure, then silence. Whoever it was didn't knock, didn't speak. They just stood there. I imagined them inches away, listening, maybe even smiling. My skin crawled. After what felt like forever, the steps moved away, fading into the dark. I didn't sleep at all after that. By morning, I had made up my mind. I would leave. I couldn't stand another night there. I packed my bag, stuffed what food I could into it, and loaded the car. The dirt road was narrow, twisting through the trees. As I drove, I checked the mirror again and again, half expecting to see a figure standing in the road behind me. But I didn't. I drove until I reached the main road, then until I saw the town. Only when I was surrounded by buildings and cars did I let myself breathe. I never reported anything. I didn't know what to say. There had been no direct threat, no crime I could prove. Just footprints, marks, sounds in the night. To anyone else, it would have sounded like imagination, like nerves playing tricks. But I knew what I had heard. I knew what I had seen carved into the wood. Even now, years later, when I think of that cabin, I don't think of the trees or the quiet. I think of standing outside in the morning light, staring at that mark in the wall, knowing someone had been inches from me as I slept. I think of the footsteps on the porch, the silence on the other side of the door, the feeling that whoever it was wanted me to know they were there. I left before I found out what they really wanted, and I am certain that leaving was the only reason I am still here to tell the story. I drove into the woods late in the afternoon, the sky already beginning to lose its color. The dirt road stretched far ahead, winding through tall trees that grew thicker the deeper I went. I had rented a small cabin for the weekend, hoping for quiet and space away from everything. The place was listed as private, isolated, and simple. That was exactly what I thought I wanted. The road narrowed as I went further in, the branches scraping along the sides of my truck. By the time I reached the clearing, the sun was low enough to throw long shadows across the ground. The cabin stood there, smaller than I expected, built of dark old logs with a slanted roof and one crooked porch light above the door. There was no other house in sight, just endless trees surrounding it. The clearing itself was uneven, with patches of grass and bare dirt, and a stack of chopped wood leaning against the side wall. When I stepped out of the truck, the air felt different. It was cooler, still, and heavy with the smell of pine and damp soil. I carried my bag up to the porch, the boards creaking under my weight, and unlocked the door with the code I had been given. Inside, the place smelled faintly of dust and old wood. It had one main room with a couch, a small table, and a wood stove in the corner. The kitchen was nothing more than a counter with a sink, a small fridge, and a few shelves. There was a single bedroom with a narrow bed and a thin mattress, and a bathroom with a rust-stained sink and a shower stall. It was simple, just like the listing had said, and I thought that would be fine. I set my bag down, looked around, and tried to let myself feel comfortable. The silence was stronger than I expected. No cars, no voices, no far-off sounds of the city. Only the occasional whisper of wind in the trees outside. I unpacked a little, made a quick meal, and tried to relax. But as the evening settled in, I couldn't shake the feeling that the woods were pressing in around me. Every window showed only darkness and branches. The cabin had thin curtains, but even with them drawn, I kept feeling like there was too much space outside and too little security inside. When night fell, it became worse. The forest went black, the kind of black you don't get in towns or neighborhoods. No streetlights, no glow from houses, only pure darkness that swallowed everything. I turned on the porch light, but its small yellow bulb barely reached the edge of the clearing. Beyond that was nothing. The first night passed without anything happening, but I barely slept. I kept hearing noises, cracks, snaps, and faint thumps. At first I told myself it was only the woods, branches falling, animals moving. But sometimes it sounded closer, like something brushing against the outside walls of the cabin. I would sit up in bed, my heart pounding, and listen, holding my breath. The noises would stop, and then I would finally lie back down. By the time morning came, I was exhausted. Sunlight spilled through the trees, and I felt foolish for how on edge I had been. The clearing looked normal again. The grass sparkled with dew, and birds were chirping in the branches above. I told myself I needed to stop imagining things and just enjoy the quiet. I spent most of that day walking around the woods near the cabin. The trees grew tall and close with thick undergrowth in places. The ground was uneven, with roots twisting out of the soil and patches of moss covering rocks. It didn't take long before I realized how easy it would be to get lost. Every direction looked the same, and once the cabin was out of sight, there were no landmarks to guide me. I didn't go far. I told myself I would stick close, within a few hundred yards, just to be safe. But as I walked, I kept noticing things that didn't feel right. Small signs. A broken branch at shoulder height that looked like it had been snapped recently. A footprint in the dirt that wasn't mine. It was larger than my boot and pressed deep into the soil, as if someone heavy had walked through not long ago. I crouched and looked at it for a while, telling myself it might have been left by someone who had been here earlier in the week. Still, the ground was damp, and the edges of the print were sharp, not washed out by rain or dried by the sun. It looked fresh. The rest of the day passed slowly. I sat on the porch for a while, read a book I had brought, and cooked a simple dinner. As the sun set again, I felt that tightness in my chest return. The thought of another night in that cabin made me uneasy, but I had no choice. That second night was worse than the first. The noises came back, and they were louder. I heard definite footsteps outside. Not heavy stomps, but soft crunches of someone moving carefully. I froze in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening. The steps circled the cabin slowly, pausing, then moving again. I wanted to look out the window, but I couldn't bring myself to pull back the curtain. I lay there, heart racing, telling myself it could be a deer, a bear, anything. But I knew it wasn't. Bears don't walk slowly in circles around a cabin. Deer don't stop and stand still for long minutes like that. I barely slept at all. When the sun rose, I finally gathered the courage to go outside. I walked around the cabin, looking at the ground. That was when I saw them. Footprints, just like the one I had found in the woods, pressed into the dirt around the clearing. They circled the cabin, sometimes coming within a foot of the walls. Some went up onto the porch, right to the front door. My stomach dropped. Someone had been here. I stood there in the morning light, staring at the tracks. They were clear and unmistakable. Someone had walked around my cabin in the night, slowly, carefully. Someone had stood at my door while I lay inside, awake and listening. I wanted to leave right then, but the cabin was deep in the woods, and the drive back was long. I told myself I could handle one more day. Maybe it was some hiker who had wandered too close. Maybe it was nothing serious. I tried to push the thought away, but it stayed with me the whole day. I didn't wander far into the woods this time. I stayed close, always keeping the cabin in sight. Every sound made me turn my head. A squirrel moving in the branches, a bird flying low, the wind rustling leaves. It all made me jump. That evening, as the sun began to set again, I stacked wood by the door and made sure everything inside was locked. The windows had flimsy latches, but I checked them all twice. I turned on the porch light and left it burning, hoping it would keep anything away. The third night was the worst. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening. For a long time, there was only silence. Then, just past midnight, I heard it. A faint creak on the porch. The sound of weight shifting on the old wooden boards. I froze, every muscle in my body tense. The creak came again, followed by another. Slow, deliberate steps, moving across the porch toward the door. Then silence. I lay there, barely breathing, waiting. Minutes passed, or maybe it was longer. I couldn't tell. Then I heard the doorknob rattle. Just once, a quick shake, as if someone was testing it. My throat went dry. My body felt frozen, but my mind was racing. The door was locked, but it was thin old wood. If someone wanted to force it, they could. For the rest of the night, I didn't move. I lay still, clutching the blanket, listening to the silence outside. I thought I heard footsteps again, moving away slowly, but I wasn't sure if I imagined it. When daylight came, I checked the porch. The dirt below the steps was covered in prints. Someone had been standing there for a long time. The knob had smudges on it, faint but visible. That was when I made my decision. I packed my bag and got ready to leave. I didn't care that it was early. I didn't care that I had paid for more nights. I wasn't going to stay in that cabin another night. I loaded my truck and started the engine. The dirt road felt narrower on the way out, the trees crowding closer. My hands gripped the wheel tight, and my eyes kept darting to the mirrors, half expecting to see someone step out of the woods behind me. When I finally reached the paved road, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. The cabin was behind me, hidden by miles of forest, but the unease didn't leave. The rest of the drive back, I couldn't stop thinking about the footprints, the doorknob, the slow footsteps on the porch. Someone had been out there every night, watching me, circling the cabin, waiting. I never found out who it was. I never went back. But even now, when I think about that place, I can picture the clearing, the dark woods pressing in, and the silent figure standing on the porch in the middle of the night, listening to me breathe on the other side of the thin wooden door. I drove for hours before reaching the turnoff that led me deeper into the forest. The main road had been quiet enough, only a few cars here and there, but once I turned onto the dirt path, the silence grew heavier. The trees leaned in from both sides, tall pines and thick brush, and the sound of gravel crunching under my tires was the only thing breaking the stillness. My shoulders ached from the long drive, and the weight of the packed supplies in the back seat reminded me how isolated I was about to be. I had rented a cabin deep in the woods, far from town, far from anyone. That had been the whole point. I thought a few days away from everything would give me a chance to breathe. But even before I reached the place, a strange unease started crawling under my skin. The cabin sat about 2 miles off the dirt path. The driveway was little more than a rutted trail with weeds growing through it. When the trees finally opened, I saw it sitting there in the clearing, a single-story wooden structure with a porch that sagged slightly on one side. The roof was patched in places with darker shingles, and one of the shutters hung crooked. It looked old, not falling apart but not cared for either. I parked the car close to the porch, grabbed my bag, and walked up the creaking steps. The air was still, the kind of stillness where you could hear your own heartbeat if you stopped moving. Inside, the cabin smelled of wood and dust. The floor groaned beneath my boots, and each step stirred up faint traces of stale air. The layout was simple. A small kitchen with chipped counters, a sitting area with an old couch, One bedroom with a narrow bed, and a bathroom with pipes that looked like they hadn't seen running water in years. There was no electricity. A few lanterns and a stack of wood near the fireplace were all I had for light and warmth. I told myself this was exactly what I wanted. Quiet, no distractions, no one around. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that the place carried something heavy, like years of silence pressed into the walls. I unpacked slowly, setting food and water on the counter, folding clothes into the dresser, laying out the blankets I had brought. I moved with care, not wanting to stir up more dust than necessary. Once the car was empty, I locked it and left it where it sat. Evening settled quickly, shadows stretching across the clearing until the cabin felt cut off from the world entirely. I lit one of the lanterns, set it on the table, and sat listening. The woods outside were strangely quiet. No chirping insects, no distant calls of birds. Just silence, broken only when the wood cracked in the fireplace or the lantern hissed faintly as it burned. The first night passed without incident, but sleep was light. I woke often, my body alert in a way I couldn't control. I kept thinking I heard small things, maybe branches shifting, maybe the shuffle of something against the porch. Every time I sat up and strained my ears, the sound stopped. It was probably nothing more than the wind, though I didn't feel any breeze when I stepped outside once in the middle of the night. I forced myself back to bed, but it was shallow rest until morning finally arrived. The next day, I explored a little. I walked a mile into the woods, following faint game trails that twisted between thick trees. The ground was damp in places, soft enough that my boots left deep marks. In some areas, I saw impressions that didn't belong to me. Large ones deep in the mud, maybe from deer or something heavier. I didn't linger. The forest had a weight to it, as if it didn't want me there. Every step deeper seemed to quiet the world even more, until I felt like I was walking in a place where sound wasn't allowed. By the time I circled back to the cabin, sweat clung to my back and my nerves were pulled tight. That night, the noises grew sharper. I was sitting near the lantern, reading a book I had brought, when I heard it. A definite crunch on the porch outside. My chest tightened, and I held my breath. The wood creaked under weight that wasn't mine, slow and deliberate, like someone testing the boards. I set the book down carefully, stood, and reached for the small hatchet I had left near the fireplace. I held it close, my palms sweating against the handle. I didn't move toward the door. I just stood there, waiting. The creaks went silent after a while, and no one came in. Still, I stayed awake most of the night, lantern burning low, eyes fixed on the door. Morning brought no answers. The porch showed no clear footprints, but the wood was weathered and dry, not soft enough to hold marks. I told myself maybe it had been an animal, a raccoon maybe, or something larger sniffing around. But deep down, I didn't believe it. The weight of those steps hadn't sounded like an animal. They had sounded slow, heavy, human. The following days blurred together. I tried to focus on simple routines, collecting wood, boiling water, keeping notes in the journal I had brought. But each night, the sounds returned. Sometimes it was the porch, sometimes it was the side of the cabin, like a hand dragging slowly across the wall. Once I thought I heard breathing just outside the bedroom window, steady and controlled, until it stopped all at once. Every time, I gripped the hatchet and forced myself to stay still. I never opened the door. I was too afraid of what might be standing there. Sleep became impossible. My body ached from lying tense for hours, ears straining in the dark. My stomach tightened from eating less, since every sound outside killed my appetite. I began to notice small changes inside the cabin too. A lantern I was sure I had left on the table appeared on the floor one morning. A chair was pushed back farther than I remembered. Once, the door to the bedroom was open when I was certain I had shut it before leaving to collect wood. Each time I told myself I must have forgotten, but I didn't believe that either. One evening, near dusk, I stepped out to bring in more firewood. As I bent to pick up the logs, I noticed something nailed into the side of a tree across the clearing. It was small, dark from weather, but clearly placed there. I walked over, and my throat went dry when I saw what it was. A rusted hook, old but still sharp, hammered into the bark at head level. Around it, The bark was scarred, as if something had been tied there before. A rope maybe, something left for years. I didn't touch it. I backed away slowly, carried the wood inside, and barred the door with whatever I could find. That night, the noise didn't stop. It started with the porch again, creaking under weight, but then moved around the cabin, circling. A steady crunch of footsteps pressed into the earth. My chest heaved as I held my breath and clutched the hatchet tighter. I could hear whoever it was pause near the windows, then move on, slow and patient. They circled for what felt like hours. When it finally went silent, I didn't move. I sat there until dawn broke through the cracks in the shutters. By then, I knew I couldn't stay. My supplies would last longer, but my nerves wouldn't. I started packing as soon as the sun was up, stuffing everything into my bag without care. I loaded the car, checked the lock twice, and climbed behind the wheel. The clearing felt different in the daylight, empty, harmless, but I knew better. As I pulled away, I caught one last glimpse of the cabin in the rearview mirror. In that moment, I noticed something I hadn't before. Near the porch steps, half hidden in the dirt, were more footprints. Not animal tracks, boots. The treads were deep, recent, and pointed straight toward the door. I didn't stop driving until the dirt road gave way to pavement, and the forest thinned behind me. My shoulders loosened only when I saw the first sign of town. I told myself I would never go back. That cabin could sit and rot into the ground for all I cared. The memory of it hasn't left me, though. Even now, when nights are too quiet, I hear those same heavy steps on the porch in my head. I remember the hook in the tree, the dragged hand across the wall, the footprints in the dirt. I never saw who it was. I never opened the door. But someone was there night after night, waiting, circling, testing how long I could last. And that is what still keeps me awake sometimes. The knowledge that whoever it was knew I was inside, that they came back again and again, and that if I had stayed even one more night, I might not have left at all. I decided to spend a week alone in a small cabin that I rented deep in the woods. I wanted to disconnect from everything for a while. I had been feeling stressed out with work, city noise, and people around me all the time. The idea of being completely alone in a quiet place far from town sounded like the best way to clear my head. I packed enough food, water, and basic supplies to last for more than a week. I also carried a flashlight, batteries, a first aid kit, and a small hunting knife, even though I didn't think I would need it. I wanted to be prepared for anything, even small problems like cutting wood or opening cans. The drive there was long. The paved road ended after about 2 hours and turned into a dirt path that twisted through thick trees. I had to drive slowly because the road was full of holes, loose stones, and branches. There were no other cars, no houses, and no signs of people. It felt like I had entered another world, one where time didn't move the same way. The deeper I drove, the quieter it became. My cell phone had lost service long before I reached the cabin. By the time I saw the small clearing with the cabin in the middle, the only sound was the crunch of my tires on gravel and the faint rattle of the wind against the trees. The cabin itself was simple. It was made of old wood, a single story with a pitched roof. The windows were small and the glass looked old and uneven, like it had been there for decades. There was a porch with 2 steps leading up to it, and the front door had a rusty lock that didn't work well. Inside, there were just 2 small rooms. The main room had a wood stove, a table, a few chairs, and a bed in the corner. The second room was even smaller, meant to be used as storage. There was no running water, no electricity, and no bathroom other than an outhouse a few steps behind the cabin. It was exactly what I had expected, but being inside it gave me a strange feeling. The silence pressed against the walls. The air smelled like old wood, dust, and damp earth. I spent the first day organizing everything I had brought. I placed the canned food in a box near the wall, kept my water jugs close to the bed, and put my flashlight and knife on the table where I could reach them easily. I collected some wood from the pile outside and stacked it neatly by the stove. I wanted everything to be ready in case the nights got cold. I ate a simple meal, listened to the faint sound of wind moving through the forest, and tried to relax. At night, the silence was so complete it almost hurt my ears. I could hear my own breathing, my heartbeat, and every small creak of the wood in the cabin. The darkness outside the windows felt thick, as if the forest swallowed all light. The first 2 nights were calm. I adjusted to the routine quickly. I woke up with the sunlight, gathered more wood, ate simple meals, and walked short distances around the cabin. I didn't want to wander too far because the forest seemed endless, and it was easy to lose your sense of direction among the tall trees. During the day, the woods were peaceful, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something could be standing just out of sight, behind the trees. Every time I turned my head quickly, I thought I saw movement, but when I stared longer, it was only branches swaying or shadows shifting. At night, I stayed inside with the door locked, the knife close by, and the flashlight within reach. I reminded myself I was safe, that I was alone, but the silence never felt like comfort. It felt heavy. On the 3rd night, something changed. I was lying in bed with the blanket pulled tight when I heard a sound outside. It was faint at first, just a crunch of leaves, but in that silence, it was impossible to ignore. I held my breath and listened. The sound came again, this time closer, slow and deliberate. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't a small animal scurrying. It was steady, like footsteps. My heart pounded. I sat up carefully and gripped the flashlight, pointing it at the window. I didn't turn it on because I didn't want to make it obvious that I was awake. I waited, straining my ears. The footsteps moved around the side of the cabin. They were slow, careful, almost cautious. Whoever or whatever it was seemed to be circling. I sat frozen for what felt like hours, though it was probably just a few minutes. Then the sound stopped. The silence returned, but now it felt even heavier. I couldn't tell if the thing had left or if it was still out there, standing in the dark, waiting. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined a figure pressing its face against the glass, watching me. When morning finally came, I forced myself outside. The ground around the cabin was covered with dead leaves and soft dirt. I walked slowly around the perimeter, scanning the ground. At first, I saw nothing unusual. Then, near the back corner, I noticed impressions in the dirt. They weren't deep, but they were shaped like footprints. They were human, not animal. The size looked average, like any grown man's shoe. The tracks weren't fresh, but they weren't old either. They had been made recently. My chest tightened as I stared at them. Someone had been outside the cabin, circling it in the middle of the night. I tried to calm myself by reasoning it out. Maybe it was a hiker who had wandered too close. Maybe someone from the nearest town had come through the woods for hunting or fishing and passed by. But the cabin was miles from any proper trail. The road to reach it was rough and hidden. Whoever made those footprints didn't just happen to stumble across it. They had come there on purpose. For the rest of the day, I couldn't relax. I kept checking the woods, staring between the trees, listening for any sound. My stomach felt tight. I barely ate. As the sun went down, dread grew inside me. I closed the door, locked it, and stacked a chair under the handle even though the lock itself was weak. I put the knife under my pillow and kept the flashlight beside me. Every creak of the cabin made me tense. The night stretched on forever, and though I thought I heard faint sounds again, I couldn't be sure if it was real or just my imagination playing tricks on me. On the 5th night, everything escalated. I was drifting in and out of uneasy sleep when a sharp sound jolted me awake. It was clear this time, a footstep on the porch. The old wood had groaned under weight. My throat tightened, and I froze completely. I strained my ears. Another creak followed. Someone was right outside the door. My hand gripped the knife so tightly my knuckles hurt. I reached for the flashlight, but I didn't turn it on yet. My breathing was shallow, my chest burning from holding back air. The sound stopped for a long time. I pictured someone standing just inches away, listening for me, waiting. Then I heard the faintest sound of the door handle moving, as if someone was testing it. The lock rattled quietly once, twice. The chair I had wedged under the handle creaked. My body trembled. I thought my heart would give me away, pounding loud enough to be heard through the walls. After a long pause, the sound stopped. The silence stretched out, deeper than ever. Minutes dragged into what felt like hours. I couldn't tell if they had left or if they were still there in the darkness, staring at the cabin, staring at me through the thin wooden walls. I didn't sleep at all that night. When morning came, I rushed outside. The porch had marks, dirt smudges near the steps where someone had clearly walked. The handle had faint scratches around it, as if someone had tried to force it. This was no hiker, no lost traveler. Someone was deliberately coming here at night, circling the cabin, trying the door, and they hadn't given up yet. The rest of the trip became a blur of fear. Every day I debated leaving early, but the drive back was long and rough, and I wasn't sure if my car would even handle it in one go. I told myself I could endure a few more days, but every night was worse than the one before. The noises outside came back again and again. Slow footsteps circling, the faint rattle of the door. Once, I even heard something brush against the window, the faint squeak of skin or fabric sliding against old glass. My nerves frayed. I was barely eating, barely sleeping. I sat in the dark with the knife clutched in my hand, waiting for the night to end. The last night was the worst. It started the same, with footsteps circling the cabin. But this time, there was no pause. The steps grew bolder, moving back and forth across the porch. The handle rattled harder, as if someone was pulling at it with force. The chair under the handle creaked loudly. I sat up in bed, gripping the knife, flashlight ready, heart hammering. Then I heard a sharp crack, wood splitting slightly. The door was being pushed harder. Panic surged through me. I thought about turning on the flashlight to scare them away, but I knew that might only show them exactly where I was. My whole body was shaking. I sat frozen, every muscle tight, waiting for the moment the door would burst open. And then, just as suddenly, it stopped. The sound of footsteps retreated, slow at first, then fading into the woods. The silence returned, heavy and suffocating. I didn't sleep. I sat up all night, knife in my hand, staring at the door until the first light of morning broke through the trees. When daylight finally came, I made my decision. I gathered everything I could carry, stuffed it into bags. I had been wanting some time away from everything for a while, and when a friend mentioned that his family owned an old cabin up north, far away from the town, I took the chance. He said no one had used it in years, but it was still standing and had all the basics I might need. I didn't mind if it was old or rough. I wasn't looking for comfort. I just wanted space, quiet, and a place where no one could bother me. The thought of being alone in the woods with no phone service felt like what I needed, and I imagined long hours of sitting by the fire, hiking in the woods, and maybe even fishing in the lake nearby. I left in the late afternoon with supplies packed in the trunk of my car. I had food, water, a small camping stove just in case, a sleeping bag, and a lantern along with batteries. I drove for hours as the sun went down, the paved road narrowing into cracked asphalt and then into gravel. The deeper I went, the quieter it became. The last town I had passed was small, just a few gas pumps and a diner, and after that, the only signs of life were broken fences, overgrown driveways, and a few abandoned barns leaning to the side. When I finally reached the dirt road that led to the cabin, it was nearly dark. Trees closed in from both sides, and the path was rough, covered with roots and rocks. The branches scraped against my car as I pushed forward, the headlights cutting through the thick woods. I drove slow, worried I might break an axle on the uneven ground, until I finally saw the cabin appear between the trees. It sat in a small clearing, the roof sagging slightly, the walls weathered and gray. The porch boards looked warped from years of rain, and the single chimney leaned just a little to one side. I parked near the porch, grabbed my bag, and stepped out. The air was colder here, heavy with the smell of pine and damp earth. The woods pressed in close, and there was no sound except for the faint rustle of leaves and the distant creak of tree limbs. I stood still for a moment, looking at the cabin, feeling that mix of relief and unease that always comes when you're about to stay in a place far away from everyone else. The door stuck when I pushed it open, but after leaning into it, it gave way with a groan. Inside, the air was stale, filled with dust and the faint smell of mildew. The floorboards creaked under my boots as I stepped in. The single main room had a wood stove against one wall, a table with 2 chairs, and an old couch with stuffing poking out. Cobwebs hung in the corners. A small doorway led to what I assumed was the bedroom. The windows were covered in grime, but enough moonlight came through for me to see. I set my bag down on the table and looked around more carefully. There were mouse droppings in one corner and old beer cans scattered near the stove. The place looked like it hadn't been touched in years. I pulled out my lantern, lit it, and placed it on the table. The warm glow spread across the walls, making the place feel a little less empty. I walked into the bedroom. It had a small bed with a thin mattress, an old dresser, and nothing else. The mattress was yellowed and sagging in the middle. I had brought my sleeping bag, so I rolled it out on top of the bed and laid down for a moment, listening. The woods outside seemed endless, and there was no hum of traffic or distant lights to give comfort. Just silence, broken every now and then by the snap of a branch outside or the faint call of an owl. I tried to settle, but as the night grew deeper, I began noticing small things that made me restless. Every time I thought I was comfortable, some new sound would drift in. The crack of wood outside, the faint shuffle against the cabin wall, the creak of the porch boards as if something had stepped on them. I told myself it was the wind, or maybe raccoons searching for food, but the more I listened, the more I was sure it wasn't just animals. I decided to walk around the cabin with my flashlight before trying to sleep. The beam cut through the darkness as I circled the cabin slowly. The trees were thick and close, their branches bending low, blocking out much of the sky. I stepped carefully, shining the light along the ground and at the porch. At first, I saw nothing unusual, but when I moved the beam toward the edge of the clearing, I froze. There were faint impressions in the dirt, like footprints. They weren't fresh, but they were clear enough that I could tell they were human. The tracks came out of the woods and stopped near the cabin before turning back again. My first thought was that hunters or hikers had been through here at some point, maybe even squatters. But something about the way the prints circled the cabin made me uneasy. It didn't look like someone had just passed by. It looked like they had been standing here, maybe watching. I told myself they were old and not worth worrying about. But when I went back inside and locked the door, the cabin no longer felt like a safe place. I kept the lantern on and sat at the table for hours, listening to every small sound. The night dragged on. At some point, I must have dozed off because I woke with my head resting on the table. The lantern had burned low, and the air was cold. For a moment, I didn't know what had woken me. Then I heard it again, a sharp sound against the window. I froze, listening hard. Another sound followed, like the faint scrape of something against the glass. I stared at the window but could see nothing beyond the dirty pane. I wanted to tell myself it was branches brushing against the cabin, but the sound was too deliberate, too slow. I reached for my flashlight, turned it on, and shined it toward the window. The light bounced back, showing only dirt and streaks on the glass. Nothing else. My heart hammered as I stood there, staring, waiting for movement. But after a while, the sound stopped. I didn't sleep again that night. In the morning, I stepped outside, trying to shake off the unease. The clearing was quiet, but when I checked the ground beneath the window, I saw fresh prints in the dirt. They were faint but real. Someone had been there during the night. The rest of the day passed slowly. I tried to go for a short hike, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every time I stopped, the woods seemed too quiet, and I felt eyes on me. I returned to the cabin earlier than I had planned and spent most of the afternoon inside, keeping the lantern close even though the sun was still up. That night, it was worse. I had locked the door again, checked the windows, and tried to tell myself I was just nervous. But after midnight, I heard the sounds return. First on the porch, the creak of the boards, slow and heavy, as if someone was shifting their weight outside the door. Then the faint scrape on the wall again, moving from one side of the cabin to the other. I sat on the bed with my flashlight in one hand and a kitchen knife I had found in the drawer in the other, waiting, holding my breath. The steps moved around the cabin slowly, circling, pausing at the windows. At one point, something brushed against the door, soft but steady. I wanted to shout, but I knew how pointless it would be. There was no one out here to hear me. I just sat in silence, every muscle tense, waiting for the sound of the lock turning or the door breaking. Hours passed before it finally stopped. I stayed awake until daylight, too afraid to move. When the sun came, I checked again outside. More prints, clearer this time. They led from the woods to the cabin, circled twice, then disappeared back into the trees. They weren't animal tracks. They were boots. That was when I realized I couldn't stay. I packed quickly, my hands shaking, and carried my things to the car. The woods felt heavier now, like they were pressing in closer. I climbed in, started the engine, and turned onto the dirt road as fast as I could without breaking something on the rough path. Every bump and crack made my teeth clench, but I didn't slow down. I just wanted out. When I reached the gravel road, I thought I was safe, but in the rearview mirror, just for a moment, I saw movement at the edge of the trees near the clearing I had left behind. Someone stood there, just far enough that I couldn't see details, only the shape. Watching, I didn't look again. I kept driving until the cabin and the woods were far behind me, until I reached the main road and the first sign of another car. I never went back. The cabin stayed in my mind for weeks after. I thought about the footprints, the sounds, the presence outside the windows. Whoever it was, they hadn't tried to break in. They had just circled, watched, and waited. And that was worse than anything else I could imagine. Knowing that out there, in the middle of the woods, I had been someone's target for the night, and I never knew why. I had decided to spend a week alone in an old cabin that belonged to a friend of mine. He had told me it was far out in the woods, past a dirt road that most people didn't use anymore. I thought it would be perfect. I had been feeling like I needed to get away from everything. No phones buzzing, no work emails, no noise from traffic or people. Just silence, trees, and a roof over my head. That was all I wanted. The cabin was small, built of weathered wood that had darkened with age. The roof sagged slightly in the middle, but it held. There was a porch that creaked when I stepped on it, and the railing had patches of green moss. Inside, it was simple. A small kitchen with old cabinets, a table with scratches across it, one bedroom with a thin mattress, and a wood stove. It wasn't much, but I wasn't looking for comfort. I was looking for quiet. The first day went exactly how I imagined. I unpacked my food supplies, stacked the firewood that had been left on the porch, and took a long walk around the property. The air felt cleaner out there, cooler, like every breath had more oxygen in it than in the city. The sound of wind moving through the trees was constant, and sometimes a bird would break it with a quick call. I walked far enough that I lost sight of the cabin for a while, then circled back until I saw the gray roof through the branches. It gave me a strange feeling in my chest, realizing how easy it was to get lost, but I told myself I would just be careful not to wander too far. That night, I lit the stove, cooked some beans, and sat at the table listening to the fire pop. It was calm. It was exactly what I wanted. I slept well, though I woke up twice to the sound of wind shaking the cabin. The second day, I tried fishing at a nearby stream. The water was clear, cold, and fast. I didn't catch anything, but I stayed for hours, crouched by the water, watching small shapes dart under the surface. I headed back in the evening, tired but content. That night, though, something felt different. I had just lain down on the thin mattress when I heard a sound outside. At first, I thought it was just branches scraping against the wall of the cabin. But then it came again, heavier. It wasn't the light scratch of wood on wood. It was the sound of something stepping, slow and deliberate, on dry leaves. I held my breath and listened harder. The sound stopped. I told myself it was a deer. I had seen deer tracks near the stream earlier. It made sense. I tried to relax, but every few minutes I thought I heard it again. Faint steps circling the cabin, pausing, then moving. I didn't sleep much that night. The next morning, I stepped out onto the porch and looked around carefully. The forest was still, except for the rustling leaves high up in the trees. I looked at the ground near the cabin. There were marks in the dirt and leaves, but it was hard to say what made them. It could have been a deer, or maybe just me from yesterday. I told myself not to think too much about it. The day passed normally enough, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't completely alone out there. When I walked through the woods, I kept glancing over my shoulder. Sometimes I thought I saw movement far back between the trees, but when I stopped and stared, nothing was there. That evening, after cooking, I locked the door to the cabin for the first time. It was a weak lock, just a simple latch, but it gave me some comfort. I sat near the stove, reading an old magazine someone had left in the drawer, until I grew tired. When I finally went to bed, I left the lantern on low. The sound came again that night. This time it was clearer. A step, then another close to the porch. I sat up in bed, my chest pounding. The walls were thin, and I could hear everything outside more clearly than I wanted to. There was a pause, and then the slow creak of the porch boards underweight. I knew that sound because I had heard it myself every time I walked onto the porch. I stayed completely still, my hands pressed into the blanket, listening so hard my ears hurt. After what felt like forever, the creaking stopped. I waited for another sound, but nothing came. I didn't sleep at all. When daylight came, I finally stepped outside. The porch boards looked normal, but when I checked the dirt at the base of the steps, there were clear prints. They weren't from a deer or any animal. They were from boots. The sight made my stomach tighten. I kept looking around, but the woods seemed empty. The prints led toward the trees and disappeared into the leaves and underbrush. I told myself it could have been a hunter, maybe passing through. Maybe they didn't realize the cabin was being used. But then I thought about the way the steps had circled, how they stopped right at the porch. That didn't feel like someone just passing through. That felt like someone watching. The rest of the day I felt uneasy. I stayed close to the cabin, cutting and stacking some of the firewood to keep myself busy. But I kept glancing into the trees, waiting for movement. By evening, my nerves were so tight that I thought about leaving. But the dirt road back was long, and it would be dark by the time I reached the truck. I decided to wait until morning. That night, I did everything I could to make the cabin feel secure. I blocked the door with a chair, even though the lock was weak. I shut the shutters on the windows and stacked a few logs inside. I kept the lantern lit, though it made shadows jump across the walls. Around midnight, the sound came again. This time, it was not cautious. I heard steps, steady and close, crunching over leaves and twigs. Then the porch creaked again, heavier, like more weight was on it. I sat in the corner near the stove, gripping a piece of firewood like a weapon. The steps moved slowly across the porch, then stopped at the door. The latch rattled. I felt my throat go dry. Someone was testing it, pulling lightly, then harder. The chair against the door shook. I held my breath so tightly I felt dizzy. After a long pause, the sound moved again. Steps crossed the porch, then silence. I waited. Minutes passed. I didn't move. Then a new sound came, faint but sharp. It was glass being touched. The small window beside the door had a thin frame. Something tapped it lightly, then pressed. The shutters rattled. I imagined a face close against the wood, trying to see inside. I stayed there all night, gripping the firewood, not closing my eyes once. When dawn finally broke, the sounds had stopped. I opened the door slowly and looked outside. The ground was a mess of boot prints. They circled the cabin, crossed the porch, stopped at the windows. Whoever it was, they had stayed there a long time. That morning, I made my decision. I packed my things quickly, stuffing food and clothes back into the bag. I kept checking the trees, half expecting to see someone standing there. When I finally stepped onto the dirt road and began walking back toward where I had left the truck, the woods felt too quiet. Every sound of my own steps seemed too loud. I kept glancing behind me. Sometimes I thought I saw something far down the trail, like a shape moving between the trees, but I never stayed long enough to look closely. I walked fast, almost running at times. When I reached the truck, I threw the bag in the back and got inside. My hands shook as I turned the key. The engine started, and I drove fast down the dirt road, bumping over rocks and holes, until I reached the paved road. I didn't stop until I was miles away. I never went back to that cabin. Later, when my friend asked me if I had enjoyed it, I just said it wasn't for me. I didn't tell him what happened. I didn't tell anyone. But the image stayed with me. The prints circling the cabin, the sound of the latch rattling, the weight on the porch. Whoever it was, they hadn't wanted to pass through. They had wanted to get in. And the only reason they didn't was because the door held, weak as it was. I think about it sometimes late at night. I imagine what would have happened if the latch had given way, or if the glass had broken. Out there, miles from anyone, no phone, no help, no way to call out. That thought is enough to keep me from ever going back into the woods alone again. I never thought a trip to a cabin would test me the way it did. When I first planned it, I imagined peace and quiet, a break from everything, somewhere I could think straight and not hear the constant noise of people and traffic. I wanted to sit by a fire at night, walk through the woods during the day, and rest without worrying about anything. That was the idea, but it turned into something very different, something that still makes my chest feel tight when I think about it now. The cabin I rented was about 3 hours away from the nearest city, tucked deep in the woods. The listing online said it had no close neighbors, no Wi-Fi, and no phone signal. At first, that sounded perfect to me. I liked the idea of being disconnected. I wanted to test myself too, to see how I'd handle real isolation. It was advertised as simple but safe, just a wooden structure with a fireplace, a kitchen that worked with propane, a hand pump for water, and a generator I could run for a few hours at night if I needed light or to charge anything. The cabin had no luxury, but I thought that would make it feel more real. I arrived in the afternoon, driving a dirt road that seemed to get narrower the farther I went. By the time I reached the cabin, branches scraped the sides of my car, and the trees grew so thick that sunlight barely touched the ground. When I parked and got out, the silence was heavy. The kind of silence you only notice when there's truly nothing around. No cars in the distance, no voices, no power lines humming, no planes overhead. Just trees, the creak of wood when the wind shifted, and my own movements. The cabin itself looked older than the pictures, but it was sturdy. Dark wood, a tin roof, a small front porch with 2 steps leading up. There was a stack of chopped firewood at the side, and a rusty metal bucket for ashes. When I unlocked the door and stepped inside, I smelled dry wood and dust. The cabin had one main room with a bed in the corner, a fireplace in the center wall, a small table with 2 chairs, and shelves holding old pans and plates. There was a separate smaller room for storage where I found lanterns, extra propane, and some tools. It was basic, but it felt good enough. I unpacked slowly, putting food in a cooler with ice, setting water jugs near the table, stacking my clothes in a corner. I brought my hunting knife, a flashlight, a hatchet, and a first aid kit. I wasn't planning on hunting or anything like that, but I liked knowing I had tools to protect myself. After everything was set, I stepped back outside. The woods were dense all around the cabin. The air was cooler than in the city, damp, and heavy with the smell of pine and soil. The first few hours were exactly what I wanted. I sat on the porch, listened to the wind in the trees, and read a little. I cooked a simple meal on the propane stove, and when the sun started going down, I lit a fire in the fireplace. The cabin glowed warmly in the dark. I felt calm, tired, and ready for quiet sleep. I thought the trip was going to be just that, simple and calm. But things changed the next day. The morning started normal. I woke up with the sun shining faintly through the trees. It was colder than I expected, so I stoked the fire again and heated water for coffee. After breakfast, I decided to walk into the woods a little. I wanted to get used to the area and see how far I could go without losing track of the cabin. I walked for about an hour, sticking to natural clearings so I wouldn't get lost. The ground was soft with pine needles, and I noticed animal tracks here and there, mostly deer and maybe raccoon. When I came back, something felt off. It wasn't anything I could see at first, but the silence seemed heavier. The kind of silence that makes your ears ring. I brushed it off, telling myself it was just in my head, that I wasn't used to such quiet. I made lunch, sat outside, and kept reminding myself this was what I came for. By late afternoon, I decided to chop some wood for the fire. I used the small axe that was left at the cabin. The work was steady, and it helped me clear my head. But halfway through, I got the feeling I was being watched. The hair on the back of my neck prickled. I stopped swinging the axe and stood still, listening. I scanned the trees, but all I saw were shadows and thick trunks. I told myself it was just the natural feeling of being alone in the woods. My brain was looking for danger where there wasn't any. I shook it off and went back to work, but I couldn't shake the tight feeling in my chest. That night, I sat inside with the lantern on, reading a book. The fire crackled low. When the lantern flickered, I thought about running the generator, but I didn't feel like walking outside in the dark to start it. I stayed with the lantern, even as it dimmed. That's when I heard the first sound. It wasn't close, but it was clear. A snapping branch. It echoed through the trees. I froze, every muscle tight. I listened, but the silence came back. I thought maybe it was a deer, maybe a raccoon. Still, I didn't like how it sounded. I set the book down and sat there for a long time, waiting. Nothing else came, so eventually I crawled into bed. Sleep was hard. I kept waking up at small noises. A creak of the cabin, a distant rustle, the wind shifting. Each time I opened my eyes, I looked at the dark outlines of the cabin walls, the faint orange glow of embers in the fireplace, and wondered what was out there. The third day was when the fear really began. I woke up groggy and decided to hike a little farther out. I thought maybe I was just too cooped up, and walking more would help me get used to the quiet. I marked trees with small cuts from my knife as I went, making sure I could find my way back. After an hour and a half, I sat down on a fallen log and ate a snack. That's when I noticed something that made my stomach twist. There was another mark on a tree about 20 feet from me. A fresh cut, cleaner than mine, sharper. It wasn't mine. I hadn't walked that far yet, and I knew I hadn't made that mark. It looked deliberate, like someone else had been marking trees too. The woods were empty around me, but I felt a wave of cold run through me. My first thought was hunters. Maybe someone else was out here hunting, marking paths. But the cabin owner had said this area was private and unused. I sat there for a while, staring at that mark, and then turned back toward the cabin. I walked fast, my heart pounding harder than it should have. When I got back, I checked the cabin surroundings carefully. I circled the whole thing, scanning the ground for tracks. I saw some broken branches near the tree line behind the cabin. They could have been made by animals, but the pattern seemed wrong. It looked like something heavy had stepped there, more deliberate than a deer. That night, I kept the fire going longer. I lit 2 lanterns instead of 1. I tried to read, but my eyes kept darting to the windows. I thought about pulling the curtains shut, but I didn't like the idea of not being able to see out. I wanted to know if anything was moving around outside. I didn't sleep much. The 4th day, I woke up tired, shaky, and uneasy. I almost packed up and left, but I told myself maybe I was overthinking. I forced myself to go about the day normal. I gathered more wood, cooked, and tried to fish in the small creek nearby. But the entire time, I kept checking the trees, looking for movement. Every sound made me jump. When the sun went down, the fear hit harder than before. Couldn't relax. I sat in the chair near the fireplace, listening to the night. Hours passed with nothing. Then, just past midnight, I heard it again. A branch snapping, closer this time, then another, then silence. I sat frozen, my heart hammering in my chest. I didn't breathe for what felt like minutes. I stared at the window, waiting. Then I thought I saw movement, just the faintest shift of a shadow near the tree line. I grabbed my knife and held it tight, though I knew it wouldn't do much if someone was really out there. I waited, shaking, until the fire burned low. I didn't sleep at all. By the 5th day, I knew something was wrong. It wasn't just my imagination. Someone was out there. I found more fresh tree cuts near the creek, not ones I had made. They were at eye level, too clean to be an animal. I noticed the cabin's woodpile looked disturbed too, like some pieces had been moved around in the night. That evening, I tried something different. I left the lantern on inside the cabin, but I turned off the fire and sat in the dark corner, waiting quietly. My breathing was slow, shallow. I listened harder than I ever had in my life. Around midnight, I heard the footsteps. Not animals, not random, slow, heavy, deliberate. moving in the dirt around the cabin. I gripped the knife so tight my hand hurt. I didn't move. The footsteps circled once, then silence. I sat there for hours, every nerve in my body screaming. On the 6th day, I made my choice. I wasn't staying another night. I packed my things as the sun came up, every sound outside making me jerk my head toward the window. I loaded my car fast, my hands shaking. When I was finally ready, I looked at the cabin one last time. The woods behind it seemed to watch me, still and heavy. As I drove down the dirt road, I kept checking my rearview mirror. At one point, I had been looking forward to a quiet weekend alone at the cabin. Life in the city had been grinding me down for months, and I wanted nothing more than silence, fresh air, and time away from people. The cabin belonged to a friend who let me borrow it whenever I needed to clear my head. It sat deep in the woods, far from the nearest town, at the end of a long dirt road that barely looked like a road anymore. I had been there before, so I knew what to expect, but something about this trip felt different the moment I started packing. I couldn't put my finger on it, but a small weight pressed on me. I ignored it, told myself I was just tired, and kept loading supplies into my car. The drive was long, nearly 4 hours. The paved highway eventually turned into gravel and then into dirt. My tires bounced over potholes and ruts as I crept along, careful not to blow a tire this far from help. Thick trees pressed close on both sides, their branches knitting together above, letting in only scattered light. I cracked the window and breathed in the smell of pine and damp earth. It was the kind of air I craved in the city but could never find. When I finally reached the cabin, the sun was dipping low. The structure stood small and weathered, wood dark from years of rain and snow. It had a sagging porch and a tin roof that rattled whenever the wind moved. Despite its worn look, it always felt like a safe place to me. I parked close, killed the engine, and sat for a moment listening to the silence. Out here, there were no voices, no traffic, no hum of machines, only birds and the faint rustle of trees. I carried my bags inside. The cabin was simple. One room with a bed in the corner, a wood stove, a rough wooden table, and a shelf of canned food left behind for emergencies. There was no electricity, no running water, no phone signal. The only link to the outside world was the dirt road I came on, and I already knew how easily that could be blocked by fallen trees or washed out by rain. That first evening passed quietly. I unpacked, chopped some wood, and built a fire in the stove. I made a simple meal of beans and bread and ate it slowly, listening to the crackle of flames. When the sky outside turned black, I lit a lantern and read a book until my eyes grew heavy. I crawled into bed, pulled the blankets high, and fell asleep to the sound of the wind brushing against the cabin walls. The next morning was different. I woke up later than I meant to, sunlight already filling the room. My first thought was how still it was. No birds, no wind, just heavy silence. I sat up and listened harder. The woods were usually alive with sound, even early in the morning, but now it felt smothered, like the whole forest was holding its breath. I tried to shake it off, telling myself maybe it was just my imagination. I ate a small breakfast and decided to walk the trail behind the cabin. The trail wound through thick trees and eventually led to a small stream. I had always liked going there to fill my water jugs and to sit for a while, but this time something gnawed at me. As I walked, I kept turning my head, feeling watched. Every snapping twig made me stop and scan the trees. The farther I went, the heavier the feeling grew. When I reached the stream, I filled my jug quickly and headed back without sitting like I usually did. Back at the cabin, I tried to relax. I stacked wood, swept the porch, and read again, but my mind kept circling back to that silence. Hours went by before I finally heard a bird call, but even that sounded brief, cut off too soon. I couldn't explain it, but it made me uneasy. That night, I struggled to sleep. I lay awake for hours, staring into the darkness, listening. Around midnight, I heard the first sound that made my chest tighten. It was faint but clear, something moving outside. Not the wind, not a small animal scurrying, but heavy steps in the leaves. Slow, deliberate, They came from the side of the cabin and circled toward the back. I held my breath and strained my ears. The steps stopped for a long moment, then continued. I told myself it could be a deer or even a bear, but deep down I knew it wasn't. Bears don't move like that, so careful and measured. I stayed awake until the sounds finally faded. My body was tense, every muscle stiff, waiting for them to return. When the first light of morning came, I sat up with aching shoulders and eyes burning from lack of sleep. I went outside to check around the cabin. The ground was soft from rain earlier in the week, and in the dirt near the back corner I found prints. Not boot prints exactly, but shoes. Human. The size looked average, maybe a little larger than mine. They led from the trees to the cabin and circled around it, just like I had heard. My stomach turned as I stared at them. Someone had been out there, watching. I tried to reason with myself. Maybe it was a hiker who got lost. Maybe they were just curious. But who wanders around a stranger's cabin in the middle of the night without knocking? My mind spun with possibilities, none of them good. I decided I would leave the next morning. I had planned to stay 3 nights, but 2 would be enough. I spent the day close to the cabin, gathering my things and keeping my ears sharp. I didn't wander the trail again. I didn't want to be far if something happened. That night was worse. I forced myself to stay awake. Lantern turned low, knife in my lap. For hours, nothing happened. Then, sometime after midnight, the sounds came again. Steps in the leaves. Closer this time, slower, almost dragging. They circled once more. Then I heard something new. Light scratching on the wooden wall, like fingers trailing along it. My skin crawled. I stayed still, heart pounding so hard I thought it would shake the bed. The scratching stopped, then silence stretched on. I finally heard retreating steps fading into the woods. I didn't sleep at all after that. When morning came, I grabbed my bags and loaded the car fast. My nerves were shot, and I didn't want to stay another minute. But when I turned the key, the engine sputtered once and died. I tried again, but nothing. The battery was fine. It was something deeper. I sat gripping the wheel, panic crawling up my throat. The car had been working perfectly yesterday. It didn't make sense. I popped the hood and stared at the engine, though I barely knew what I was looking at. That's when I noticed it. The cable was cut clean through. Not worn, not chewed by animals, but sliced. Someone had tampered with it. The realization made my chest seize. Whoever had been outside wasn't just wandering. They wanted me trapped here. I slammed the hood and looked at the long road stretching away. Walking out was possible, but it was miles to the nearest paved road and even farther to town. Still, staying here felt worse. I stuffed what I could into a backpack. Water, food, flashlight, knife, and locked the cabin behind me even though I knew it wouldn't stop anyone determined. I started walking. The forest felt different now, hostile. Every sound made me flinch. I kept glancing behind me, expecting to see someone step onto the road. Hours passed as I trudged through mud and over ruts. My legs ached, and sweat ran down my back despite the cool air. At some point, I noticed something that froze me. Fresh footprints in the mud ahead. Not mine. They were too far apart, heavier, like someone larger had walked the same road not long before. I crouched and touched the edges. Still damp. Whoever it was, they weren't far ahead. I thought about turning into the trees to circle around, but fear of getting lost kept me on the road. I pressed forward, moving slower now, ears straining for any hint of movement. As the sun started sinking again, I realized I wouldn't make it out before dark. Panic threatened to swallow me. I needed shelter, any shelter. That's when I spotted a small clearing just off the road with an old hunting shack. It was barely standing, roof sagging, door hanging crooked, but it was something. I stepped inside and set my bag down. The air smelled of rot and mold. Holes in the walls let in strips of dying sunlight. I slid the broken door shut as best I could and sat against the far wall, knife in hand, flashlight ready. Darkness settled fast. My stomach twisted with hunger, but I couldn't bring myself to eat. I sat listening. That was when I heard it again. Steps. This time on the road outside. They paused near the shack, then slowly crunched closer. I held my breath, gripping the knife until my knuckles ached. The steps circled the shack just like they had circled the cabin. Wood creaked under light pressure, like someone pressing a hand against the wall. I stayed still for hours, every second stretching longer than the last. Finally, silence returned. I didn't sleep. I sat frozen, waiting for morning. When light finally filtered through the holes, I wasted no time. I slipped out and kept walking, moving faster despite exhaustion. I didn't stop for water, didn't stop for food. By late afternoon, I finally reached the paved road. Relief flooded me when I saw a car in the distance. I flagged it down, barely able to speak, and the driver took me into town. I never went back for my car. Authorities later told me they found signs of someone living in those woods. I had been looking forward to a quiet weekend away from everything. My plan was simple. Drive out to a small cabin I had rented deep in the woods, spend some time alone, and just shut out the noise of daily life. I had been working long hours for months, feeling worn down and drained, and I thought that being somewhere isolated would help me reset. The cabin I picked wasn't part of a resort or near any town. It was listed by a guy who owned a few acres of forest land, and from the pictures online, it looked small and plain but good enough for a few nights. There was no Wi-Fi, no phone signal, no TV. Just 4 walls, a roof, a wood stove, and the silence of the woods. I drove up on a Friday afternoon. The sun was already low when I turned off the main road onto a narrow dirt path that wound into the forest. The further I drove, the rougher the road became. The trees grew denser and taller on both sides, their branches almost closing in above me, blocking most of the light. The sound of my tires crunching over gravel and dirt was the only thing breaking the stillness. Every few hundred feet, I slowed down because of potholes filled with old rainwater or tree roots pushing through the ground. My car wasn't meant for off-road driving, so I was tense, gripping the steering wheel tightly, making sure I didn't scrape the underside of the car or get stuck. After about 15 minutes of this slow crawl, I reached a small clearing. The cabin stood at the far end of it, dark brown logs stacked together. A small porch with 2 wooden steps leading up, and a tin roof that looked a little rusted at the edges. There were no other houses around, no signs of neighbors, and no sound of traffic. Just the quiet of the forest, broken every now and then by the distant call of a bird or the rustle of wind through the branches. I parked off to the side on a patch of dirt, shut off the engine, and just sat there for a moment. The silence pressed in so heavy it was almost uncomfortable. I hadn't realized how used I had become to background noise, cars on the street, people talking, the hum of electronics. Out here, there was none of that. I got out, stretched my legs, and unloaded my things. I had packed light. A backpack with clothes, some canned food and snacks, bottled water, a flashlight, a small first aid kit, and a few other basics. I also brought a cooler with ice for some fresh food. I carried everything up onto the porch, found the key under the mat where the owner said it would be, and unlocked the door. Inside, the cabin smelled of old wood and dust. It wasn't dirty, just stale, like it hadn't been used in months. The interior was simple. 1 room that served as a kitchen and living space, a small bedroom off to the side, and a tiny bathroom with just a sink and toilet. There was no shower. The furniture was minimal. An old couch, a wooden table with 2 chairs, and a bed with a thin mattress. There was a small shelf with a few books left behind, some matches, candles, and a couple of empty glass jars. The windows were small and covered with thin curtains. The wood stove stood in the corner with a pile of chopped logs stacked next to it. I walked through the place, checked that everything seemed in order, and dropped my bag in the bedroom. The bed squeaked when I set it down. I went back outside to get some air and looked around the clearing. The trees stood thick and tall, stretching in every direction, their trunks close together, their tops moving gently with the wind. The dirt path I had come in on disappeared into them, and from where I stood, it already looked like nothing more than a dark tunnel. By the time I finished settling in, the sun had gone down. The inside of the cabin was already dim. I lit one of the candles, set it on the table, and ate some food out of the cooler. The place creaked occasionally, wood shifting as the air cooled. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just the building settling. That night, I lay in bed listening to the silence. At first it was peaceful, but as the hours dragged on, it became almost unnerving. I kept waiting for sounds I was used to, cars, voices, planes overhead, but all I heard was the occasional snap of a branch outside or a faint rustle in the leaves. Every time I heard something, my body tensed, because out here, every sound stood out sharp and clear. Around midnight, I thought I heard something heavier moving outside in the clearing. My mind instantly went to animals, maybe a deer, maybe something larger. I didn't get up to check. I just lay there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, trying to slow my breathing until eventually I drifted off. The next morning, I woke early. Sunlight came through the thin curtains, and for a moment, I felt calm again. I stepped outside and took a deep breath of the cold morning air. The ground was damp from dew, and the air smelled of pine and soil. I walked around the clearing a little. The ground was uneven, covered with patches of grass and weeds. I noticed something then that made me pause. On the far edge of the clearing, near the tree line, the ground looked disturbed. Patches of dirt had been scuffed up, and there were faint tracks pressed into the soil. They weren't shoe prints exactly, but they also didn't look like deer tracks. The shapes were vague, just impressions, as if something heavy had passed through. I crouched down to look closer, but couldn't make much sense of them. I told myself it was probably just animals moving around at night. Still, the thought stuck with me as I went back inside to make coffee on the little gas burner the cabin had. The day passed slowly. I walked along the dirt path for a while, not too far because I didn't want to lose my bearings. The forest seemed endless, tree after tree with no clear landmarks. It was easy to imagine how someone could get lost out there within minutes. I returned to the cabin and spent the afternoon reading one of the old books on the shelf, then chopping some wood for the stove. By evening, I felt more relaxed, but that night, things felt different again. After I lay down, I heard noises outside. At first, just the usual rustling of branches in the wind. Then something sharper, like the sound of a footstep on dry leaves. Then another, closer. I held my breath, straining to hear. The steps didn't continue. Everything went quiet again. I told myself it was probably an animal, but the pattern of the sound didn't feel like an animal moving. Felt slower, more careful. I didn't sleep much that night. I kept waking, listening, staring at the dark window. At some point, I thought I heard a faint scrape along the porch. It was so light, I almost convinced myself I imagined it. In the morning, I checked outside. On the porch, near the steps, I saw a smudge of dirt, like something had brushed against the wood. It wasn't clear enough to be a print, but it hadn't been there before. My stomach tightened, but again, I forced myself to reason it out. Maybe an animal had wandered up, sniffing around. Maybe a raccoon or something like that. The day dragged. I tried to distract myself by walking deeper into the woods, but I couldn't shake the unease. Every snapped twig behind me made me turn my head. Every shadow between the trees looked like someone standing there. By late afternoon, I gave up and went back to the cabin, closing the door and locking it, even though I knew the lock was flimsy and wouldn't stop much if someone really wanted to get in. That evening, I decided to stay awake longer, just to listen. I sat on the couch with a candle burning low, waiting. Hours passed. Nothing happened. The silence grew heavier, my eyelids grew heavy too, and I finally went to bed. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke to a sound. A slow, steady creak. My heart jumped. It was coming from the porch. Then a faint thump, as if weight had shifted on the wooden steps. I stayed completely still, every muscle tense, my ears straining. Then silence. I waited, barely breathing, for what felt like forever. Finally, I heard it again. Another creak, closer to the door this time. I stared at the door through the crack in the bedroom doorway. My mind raced with possibilities. Could it still be an animal? But it sounded too heavy, too deliberate. I thought about getting up, grabbing something for protection, but I was frozen. Minutes passed. The creak stopped. I stayed awake until dawn, listening, waiting for another sound. None came. When the sun came up, I forced myself to check the porch. My chest felt tight as I opened the door. There, on the wooden boards, were clear prints. Not shoes exactly, not boots, but bare feet. Large, adult-sized, pressed faintly into the dust and dirt that had gathered on the porch. My stomach dropped. These weren't animals. The realization hit me hard. Someone had been standing right outside the cabin in the middle of the night. Someone barefoot. My mind flooded with questions I couldn't answer. Who would be out here? Why would they come this close? Why no shoes? I backed into the cabin and locked the door again, my hands shaking. I knew I should leave, pack up, get in the car and drive out. But a part of me hesitated. It was early, the forest road was rough, and I kept thinking maybe I was overreacting. Maybe it was nothing more than some drifter passing through. Maybe they were gone. I spent the day restless, pacing, checking the windows. That night, I didn't sleep